Hey guys, tonight we trudge into the dry, swirling dust of 16th century La Mancha, a place where the sun is a heavy golden hammer and the horizon stretches out like a long, exhausted sigh. We are stepping back to a time when Spain was the center of the world, yet somehow felt like it was crumbling under the weight of its own armor. We're going to find the man who decided that reality was merely a suggestion and that madness was the only logical response to a boring life. You're deep in the heart of a parched Spanish plateau, inside a house that smells of old leather and lentil stew, and fair warning, you probably won't survive this, not because of a charging giant, but because the sheer amount of dust in this library might actually mummify you before we reach the second chapter. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's strangely comforting to know that while we're wandering through the Spanish scrubland, you might be listening from a rainy porch in Seattle or a moonlit balcony in Madrid. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across a floor made of cold, uneven stone, the kind that has been polished smooth by generations of nervous pacing. The air here is stagnant, heavy with the scent of crumbling parchment and the metallic tang of a rusted sword that hasn't seen a whetstone since the Moors were in power. You are study of Alonso Quijano, a man whose skin is the colour of a potato that's been forgotten in a dark cellar. He is thin, his face is gaunt, and his eyes look like two burnt holes in a piece of parchment. He's been awake for 3 days. You know this because you can see the stack of books beside him. Massive, leather-bound tomes with titles like Amadis de Gaula and Palmyrene of England. You probably wouldn't survive 72 hours of sustained reading without a triple espresso, but Alonso is fueled by the kind of manic energy usually reserved for toddlers who have just discovered the concept of unlimited sugar. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that these books of chivalry were the absolute blockbuster media of the 16th and 17th centuries. They were the superhero movies of their day, filled with knights who could decapitate 20 giants with a single swing and wizards who could turn a castle into a block of Swiss cheese. Alonso hasn't just been reading them, he's been inhaling them, he's been eating them. His brain has dried up to the point where the ink on the page has replaced the blood in his veins. He looks at his reflection in a wavering, mercury-backed mirror, and he doesn't see a middle-aged bachelor with a receding hairline. He sees a knight-errant. He sees a man whose destiny is to restore the golden age of chivalry, even if he has to do it on a skeletal horse that looks like a collection of coat hangers held together by hide. A quirky or fringe tidbit that historians love to whisper about is that Cervantes likely modelled Alonso's madness on real medical theories of the time. In the early 1600s, it was believed that excessive reading heated the brain, causing the animal spirits to boil over and create hallucinations. Imagine a world where WebMD would diagnose your love for Tolkien as a literal brain fire. Alonso is currently at the peak of that fire. He reaches for a suit of armour that belonged to his great-grandfather. Pieces of iron so spitted with orange rust, they look like they've been recovered from a shipwreck. He spends hours scrubbing them with a piece of old felt, the sound of metal on metal creating a rhythmic, scraping ASMR that would be relaxing if it weren't being done by a lunatic in a rough collar. Historians still argue whether the village Alonso lives in was a specific real-world location, or if Cervantes deliberately kept it vague to mock the entire region of La Mancha. Regardless, you feel the heat of the village square as you step outside with him. It's the kind of heat that makes the air look like it's vibrating. Alonso is wearing his armour now, including a helmet he repaired, with bits of cardboard and green ribbon. He looks like a man who just lost a fight with a craft store. He climbs onto Rocinante, his horse, whose ribs are so prominent you could use them as a xylophone, and begins his first sally. He is a solo act. No squire, no plan, just a lance that is suspiciously similar to a curtain pole and a heart full of dangerous nostalgia. You trudge behind him as he reaches a local inn at twilight. To Alonso, this isn't a stinking, flea-ridden roadside dump. It's a castle with silver turrets. The two prostitutes standing at the door aren't women working a tough job. They are high-born ladies in waiting. You watch as he kneels before the innkeeper. a man whose belly is so large it has its own gravitational pull and begs to be dubbed a knight. The innkeeper, sensing a chance for a free laugh and maybe some coins, agrees. The night air is cool, smelling of damp straw and mule manure. You watch Alonso perform a vigil of arms in the courtyard, pacing back and forth under the moonlight while guarding his pile of rusted iron. He attacks a mule driver who tries to move his armor to water the animals, hitting the poor guy with a lance strike that sounds like a dry branch snapping. He is a menace, he is a poet, and he is a disaster. By the time the sun begins to peek over the horizon, Alonso has been knifed by a bewildered innkeeper, using a ledger book instead of a Bible. He heads home to get a squire and some clean shirts, but not before getting into a fight with a group of merchants and ending up face down in the dirt, being beaten with his own lance. It's a messy, painful start to the greatest story ever told. You watch as a neighbour finds him and hauls him back to his village in a cart, while Alonso mutters about enchanters and lost glory. His library is walled up by his friends who think they are saving his soul, but they don't realise that the door to his mind has already been kicked wide open. You trudge back into the shadows of that silent, sun-baked village, but this time the air feels a little different. The heavy, medicinal scent of lanced boils and barber surgeons has been replaced by the sharp, pungent aroma of raw garlic and the earthy, humid musk of a stable. You are standing outside a small, lopsided hut that looks like it was built by someone who had a very loose relationship with the concept of a right angle. This is the home of Sancho Panza, a man whose name literally translates to Sancho Belly, and who is currently the only person in La Mancha capable of tolerating Alonso Quijano's company for more than 5 minutes. You watch from the darkness as Quijano, now firmly and dangerously Don Quixote, leans over a low stone wall, his silver-painted cardboard visor glinting in the moonlight. He is whispering to Sancho, who is currently more interested in a piece of hard cheese than in the restoration of the Golden Age. You hear the knight make the pitch that has launched 1,000 literary ships, the promise of an insula, or an island. In the 17th century, the idea of being the governor of an island was the equivalent of winning the Powerball, while simultaneously being handed the keys to a private Caribbean resort. Sancho, who is a good man but with very little salt in his brain pan, as Cervantes puts it, looks at his scrawny neighbour and then at his own empty pockets. You probably wouldn't survive a job interview where the salary was maybe an island later. But Sancho has a family to feed and a donkey that needs a new harness, so he signs on. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that in the early 1600s, the insula wasn't just a fantasy. It was a deeply ingrained part of the Spanish colonial psyche. Everyone knew someone who had gone to the New World and supposedly become a king of some tropical rock. To a peasant like Sancho, whose life was measured in the number of chickpeas he could scrounge from a dry field, the knight's madness doesn't look like insanity. It looks like a career path with significant upward mobility. You feel the weight of Sancho's hope as he packs a pair of saddlebags with a hunk of bacon and a wineskin that looks like a deflated leather balloon. The departure happens in the dead of night, a stealth sally that would make a ninja jealous. You trudge behind them as they slip out of the village, the only sound being the rhythmic, metallic clink-clank of Quixote's armour and the soft, dusty thud-thud of Sancho's donkey. They make an absurd pair, Quixote long and spindly like a praying mantis in a tin can, and Sancho short and round like an animated potato. Historians still argue whether Sancho is actually a fool who believes his master, or a brilliant pragmatist who is simply playing the long game to see how far the crazy man's credit will stretch. You see them silhouetted against the indigo sky, a high-definition image of human delusion meeting human greed, and it's strangely beautiful. As the sun begins to hammer the plains of La Mancha into submission the next morning, the air turns into a shimmering curtain of heat. You feel the sweat prickling under your own collar, but Quixote doesn't seem to notice. He is too busy looking at the horizon. And then you see them, 30 or 40 massive white-winged shapes rising out of the Campo de Criptana. To you, they are windmills, the latest and greatest in 16th century industrial technology. To Quixote, they are monstrous giants with arms 2 leagues long. A quirky or fringe tidbit that most people miss is that windmills were actually a relatively new sight in La Mancha during Cervantes' time. They were high-tech imports from the Low Countries, designed to grind grain in a region where water was scarce. To an old-fashioned hidalgo who hated change, these whirring, creaking machines might have actually seemed like invading monsters. You watch as Quixote lowers his lance, the curtain pole from earlier, and spurs Rocinante into a gallop. He isn't just charging a building, he's charging the future, and the future usually wins by a knockout. The sound of the wind is a low, moaning howl as it catches the canvas sails. Whoosh, whoosh. It's a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that should be relaxing, but as Quixote gets closer, it turns into a terrifying roar of moving timber. You watch the impact in slow motion. The lance hits the wooden sail. The sail hits back with the force of a falling house, and suddenly the knight is airborne. There is a sickening crunch of wood and cardboard, followed by the dull, heavy thud of a man in armor hitting the parched earth. You probably wouldn't survive being hit by a 16th century industrial turbine. But Quixote is made of tougher stuff, or at least his delusions are. You trudge over to where he lies in a heap of tangled limbs and bent iron. Sancho is already there, shouting, "Did I not tell your worship they were but windmills?" Quixote looks up, his eyes unfocused, blood trickling from his nose, and gives the ultimate excuse: enchanters. He explains that the wizard Freston, his sworn enemy, turned the giants into windmills at the last second just to rob him of the glory of victory. It's the original fake news defense. He didn't lose. The reality was simply hacked by a sorcerer. You feel the dry wind of La Mancha picking up again, carrying the scent of dust and failure. As Sancho hauls his master back onto the skeletal horse, you realize that the knight's madness is armor in itself. It protects him from the bruises of the real world by turning every defeat into a conspiracy. You follow them as they move deeper into the plains, heading toward the Sierra Morena, while the windmills continue to turn behind you. Indifferent to the hero who just tried to kill them, they whir and creak, a mechanical lullaby for a world that is moving too fast for a man who just wants to be a legend. You trudge away from the creaking ghosts of the windmills, the sound of their spinning sails fading into a rhythmic wooden groan that eventually dissolves into the absolute silence of a La Mancha night. The air has turned brittle and cold, smelling of damp earth and the sharp, resinous scent of pine needles as the road begins to tilt upward into the jagged shadows of the Sierra Morena. You are walking in a darkness so thick it feels like velvet pressing against your eyeballs. The only thing keeping you on the path is the occasional spark of Rocinante's hooves hitting flint and the heavy, anxious breathing of Sancho Panza, who is currently convinced that every bush is a ghost and every shadow is a tax collector. Suddenly, a sound breaks the night. Thump, thump, thump. It is a heavy metallic vibration that seems to shake the very marrow of your bones. It's a slow industrial percussion, clack-thud, clack-thud, echoing through the ravine like the heartbeat of a subterranean giant. You probably won't survive this level of suspense without your heart jumping into your throat. But Don Quixote is in his element. He doesn't see a terrifying mystery. He sees an opportunity for the adventure of the fulling hammers. He tells Sancho to stay back while he prepares to face whatever monstrous thing is making that noise. Sancho, however, is so paralyzed by fear that he secretly ties Rocinante's legs together with his donkey's halter, so the horse can only hop. It's a brilliant, desperate move from a man who is literally trembling so hard his teeth are chattering like a pair of castanets. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that these fulling hammers were actually part of a common 17th century watermill used for processing wool. Huge wooden mallets would beat the fabric to clean and thicken it. To a modern ear, it's a rhythmic, industrial ASMR. To a medieval-minded knight in a dark forest, it sounds like the drums of war. You feel the absurdity of the situation as the sun rises, revealing 6 harmless wooden hammers powered by a stream. Don Quixote's face falls, not because of the danger, but because of the lack of it. He is a man who is only happy when he's being threatened by something that doesn't exist. To make matters worse, Sancho laughs so hard he nearly falls off his donkey, and Quixote responds by hitting him twice with his lance. You probably wouldn't survive a boss who handles feedback with a wooden pole, but Sancho just shrugs it off and starts talking about lunch. As you trudge further down the road under a light, drizzling rain, the scent of wet iron and ozone fills the air. You see a man approaching on a mule, wearing something on his head that glitters like a fallen star. To you, it's a barber carrying a brass basin to protect his hat from the rain. To Quixote, it is the legendary golden helmet of Mambrino, an artifact that supposedly makes the wearer invincible. A quirky or fringe tidbit that often gets overlooked is the dual nature of that basin. In 1605, a barber's basin was a specific tool with a semicircle cut out of the rim, so it could be held against a customer's neck during a shave or, more importantly, during bloodletting. It was a symbol of the barber-surgeon trade we talked about earlier. Quixote charges the poor barber, steals the basin, and puts it on. It doesn't fit, of course. He wonders why the enchanted helmet has such a huge hole in it, and concludes that some ignorant person must have melted down half of it for the gold. He wears it anyway, looking like a man who is trying to receive satellite signals with kitchenware. You probably wouldn't survive a commute wearing a brass bowl, but Quixote wears it with the dignity of an emperor. The journey takes you deeper into the Sierra Morena, a place of wild goats and desperate outlaws. You find Quixote deciding to perform a penance for his lady Dulcinea. He strips down to his shirt and begins doing somersaults and headstands in the dirt, scratching his poems into the bark of trees. It is a pathetic, heartbreaking and hilarious sight. A middle-aged man in his underwear, acting out a scene from a bad romance novel in the middle of a wilderness. Sancho is sent back to the village with a letter, but instead, he runs into the local priest and barber, who have come to rescue the knight. Historians still argue whether the enchantment that follows was meant as a critique of the church's power, or a simple plot device to get the characters home. The priest and the barber recruit a local girl named Dorotea to pretend she is a princess in distress to lure Quixote out of the mountains. It works, but only after a series of massive brawls at an inn involving wineskins that Quixote mistakes for giants. You can smell the sour fermented scent of red wine flooding the floor as the knight stabs the giants, convinced he is swimming in the blood of his enemies. Finally, you watch the most tragic comic scene of part 1. The priest and barber convince Quixote that he has been enchanted by a wizard and must be transported back to his village in a wooden cage on the back of an ox cart. You trudge beside the slow-moving wagon. The sound of the wooden wheels creaking, "Eronk, Eronk," is a mournful lullaby. Quixote sits behind the iron bars, his brass basin helmet tilted to one side, looking out at the world with a confused saintly patience. He believes this is a noble trial, a test of his knightly resolve. He doesn't realize he is being hauled home like a dangerous animal by the people who love him. The dust of the road settles on his rusted armor, turning him into a great, motionless statue. You feel the weight of his capture. It's a cage built of wood, but lined with the crushing reality of a world that has no room for dreamers who refuse to wake up. You trudge back into the village of La Mancha, but the air feels strangely heavy with a scent you haven't encountered in these dusty streets before. The acrid, chemical bite of fresh printer's ink and the vanilla-sweet aroma of aging paper. It is 10 years since we left Don Quixote in his wooden cage, and the world has fundamentally shifted. You are walking through a village that is no longer just a collection of stone huts. It is now a landmark. People are visiting from Madrid and Toledo, pointing at the windows and whispering. You probably won't survive this level of fame. It's like being the subject of a viral video in an age where the only way to like something is to buy a leather-bound book and read it by a dim tallow candle. You find yourself standing outside Quixote's house again. The door is slightly ajar, and inside you hear a new voice, not the raspy, dry mutter of a madman, but the sharp, confident tones of a university student. This is Sanson Carrasco, a Bachelor of Arts, who looks like he swallowed a library and is currently trying to digest it. He is holding a book, and as you peek through the doorway, you realize it's the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha. This is the ultimate inception moment. You watch as Quixote and Sancho learn that their private disasters, the windmills, the wineskins, the beatings, have been published for the entire world to laugh at. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that this was a revolutionary moment in literature. Cervantes was the first author to have his characters become aware of their own fictional existence in a sequel. It's metafiction 4 centuries before Hollywood invented the fourth wall. You feel the weirdness of it as you watch Sancho Panza's face. He's not upset that he's in a book. He's upset that the author, Sidi Hameti Benengeli didn't spend more time describing the exactly how much bacon was in his saddlebags. You probably wouldn't survive being an influencer in 1615, where your comments section is just a scholar from Salamanca telling you that your life is a parody. A quirky or fringe tidbit that Cervantes actually wrote into the text was his absolute, burning rage at a fake sequel. While he was taking his time writing Part 2, an anonymous author under the name of Avellaneda published a false Quixote that was mean-spirited and poorly written. Cervantes was so petty, and rightfully so, that he changed the entire plot of his actual book just to spite the imposter. You see Quixote decide not to go to a jousting tournament in Zaragoza simply because the fake Quixote went there. It is history's first recorded instance of a literary beef, and it is glorious. You trudge along behind the duo as they set out on their third sally, but the vibe has turned toxic. Before, the world was indifferent to them. Now, the world is in on the joke. You enter the grand, sprawling estate of a duke and duchess. The air here smells of orange blossoms, expensive beeswax polish, and the cold, sharp scent of irony. These aristocrats have read Part 1, and they are bored. They are the 17th century equivalent of trust fund kids, with too much time on their hands and a mean streak the size of the Mediterranean. Historians still argue whether the Duke and Duchess were meant to represent the moral decay of the Spanish nobility, or if they were just a narrative device to put Quixote in a more civilized setting. You feel the cruelty in the palace halls. They don't beat Quixote with sticks, they beat him with elaborate, expensive pranks. They convince him that a wooden horse named Clavileño can fly through the air if he and Sancho are blindfolded. You watch them sit on a stationary piece of timber while servants blow bellows in their faces and hold torches nearby to simulate the heat of the sun in the upper atmosphere. The sound of the bellows, whoosh, whoosh, is the sound of a world that has turned the knight's noble dreams into a circus act for the rich. You probably wouldn't survive a weekend with these people without wanting to set the palace on fire. They even trick Sancho into thinking he has finally received his insula, the island of Barataria. You trudge behind the short squire as he is led to a small landlocked village that he thinks is surrounded by sea. For 10 days, Sancho actually governs. He settles disputes, handles legal cases, and shows more common sense than the Duke ever had. But the enchanted reality of the palace always catches up. They stage a fake night attack, trampling Sancho in the dark and terrifying him, until he realizes that being a governor isn't worth a single day of his donkey's company. As you walk away from the Duke's palace at night, the scent of the orange trees is replaced by the smell of the open road again. Quixote looks older. His armor is cleaner, thanks to the Duke's servants, but his spirit looks frayed. He is starting to realize that the enchantments aren't just from wizards. They are coming from the people who pretend to be his friends. The laughter of the Duchess echoes in the distance, a high, tinkling sound that feels like needles in the skin. You follow the knight and his squire as they head toward Barcelona, toward the sea, toward a reality that is finally starting to grow taller than the knight's tallest stories. The road is long, and the moon is a cold, silver basin in the sky, reminding you that in a world full of official versions, the truth is usually the thing getting trampled in the dark. You trudge along a road that has finally, mercifully, run out of dust. The parched, yellow scrubland of the interior has given way to something you haven't felt in this entire journey. A cool, wet breeze that carries the sharp, stinging scent of salt and the rhythmic, low-frequency roar of the Mediterranean. You are standing on the beach of Barcelona. It is dawn, and the light is a pale, watery blue, reflecting off the damp sand like a sheet of hammered tin. The air is heavy with the smell of rotting seaweed and the clean, metallic tang of the harbour. You probably won't survive this sudden change in climate. Your lungs, which have been basically a filter for La Mancha topsoil for the last few weeks, are currently having a mild panic attack at the sheer quality of the oxygen. Beside you, Don Quixote is a statue of rusted iron. He is staring at the ocean, the first time he has ever seen it, and his expression is one of profound, quiet terror. To him, this isn't just water, it's an infinite blue enchantment. Sancho Panza is busy trying to figure out if you can eat a jellyfish, but the night is focused on the horizon, and then, out of the morning mist, he appears. A rider on a horse that actually looks healthy, wearing armor so polished it looks like it was carved from a fallen star. He calls himself the Knight of the White Moon. He doesn't want Quixote's gold or his horse. He wants his pride. He challenges Quixote to a duel, with a single condition. If Quixote loses, he must go home, hang up his sword, and live a life of quiet peace for 1 full year. You watch the charge in absolute silence. No windmills this time. No confused sheep. This is the real deal. A 17th century version of a high stakes. It's just a prank, bro, that has gone way too far. The sound of the horses galloping across the wet sand is a heavy rhythmic thudding, splut thump, splut thud, that vibrates through the soles of your boots. The Knight of the White Moon is faster, stronger and younger. You watch as his lance catches Quixote square in the chest, lifting the lean, spindly man clean out of his saddle. There is no conspiracy of enchanters this time. No Freston to blame. Just the dull, wet thwap of a man hitting the tide line and the sound of a brass basin helmet rolling across the pebbles like a discarded soup pot. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that Don Quixote is the most translated book in history after the Bible, and this moment on the beach is the reason why. It is the moment the dream finally hits the wall of the real world and shatters. You trudge over to the fallen knight. He looks smaller than he did in the library. He looks like a man who has finally realized that cardboard and green ribbon don't make you invincible. The Knight of the White Moon removes his helmet, and you see the face of Sanson Carrasco, the university student from the village. He didn't do this to be mean, he did it to save his friend's life. He used the only language Quixote understood, the language of chivalry, to force him back to reality. You probably wouldn't survive a friend who tries to help you by knocking you off a horse with a giant stick. But in 1615, this was the peak of tough love. The journey home is a long, melancholic trudge. You are walking behind a defeated man. The Knight of the Sorrowful Countenance has never looked more accurate. The air smells of dry grass and the lingering smoke of autumn fires as you cross back into La Mancha. Sancho tries to cheer his master up by suggesting they all become shepherds and spend their days playing flutes and naming sheep after their girlfriends. It's a 17th century version of, let's just move to a farm and start a podcast. But Quixote isn't listening. The fire in his brain, that manic, beautiful heat that turned windmills into giants, is finally going out. Historians still argue whether the ending of the novel is a tragedy or a triumph of reason. As you step back into the village, the atmosphere is hushed. There is no parade, no cheering crowds, just the sound of a single church bell tolling in the distance. You enter Quixote's bedroom, and the scent of the library, that vanilla-sweet smell of old paper, is now mixed with the medicinal bitterness of lavender and sage. Quixote's in bed, his gaunt face pale against the white pillows, and then he speaks, but he doesn't talk about wizards or enchanted islands. He calls himself Alonso Quijano the Good. The madness has evaporated, leaving behind a man who is lucid, tired, and deeply, profoundly sorry for the trouble he's caused. A quirky or fringe tidbit that Cervantes actually included in the final pages was his insistence that Quixote must die. After the fake sequel by Avellaneda, Cervantes was taking no chances. He wrote a scene where a notary comes in to certify that Quixote is truly, legally, and biologically dead, specifically so that no other imposter author could ever try to bring him back for a cheap buck. It's the ultimate series finale move. You watch as the notary dips his quill into the ink, scritch-scratch, and records the end of an era. Quixote dies not as a hero in a battle, but as a good neighbour in his own bed, while Sancho Panza weeps at his feet, begging him to stay crazy just a little bit longer. You trudge out of the house for the last time, the door closing with a soft, final thud. The village of La Mancha is still there, the olive trees are still twisted, the sun is still a hammer, and the windmills are still turning on the ridge. But the world feels a little flatter, doesn't it? A little less colourful. You realise that while Quixote's madness was dangerous and messy, it was also the only thing that made the parched plains look like a kingdom. As you walk away into the cool twilight, you hear the distant whoosh-whoosh of the windmill sails, a mechanical heartbeat for a world that finally won its battle against a dreamer. You carry the weight of his story with you, a reminder that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is refuse to believe in the limits of the world, even if it eventually beats you into the dirt for it. You trudge away from the quiet candlelit deathbed of Alonso Quijano, but the silence doesn't last for long. The scent of lavender and sage is suddenly ripped away, replaced by the choking acrid stench of black gunpowder, salt spray, and the metallic tang of blood warming under a Mediterranean sun. We are stepping back 44 years away from the dry plains of La Mancha and onto the blood-slicked deck of a galley named the Marquesa. It is October 7, 1571, and you are currently in the middle of the Battle of Lepanto, the largest naval engagement the world has seen in over a millennium. You probably won't survive this. Not just because of the 600 ships currently trying to turn each other into toothpicks, but because the sheer noise of 200,000 men screaming and 5,000 cannons firing at once is enough to rattle your soul right out through your teeth. So take a moment to adjust your grip on your arquebus, that heavy, primitive firearm that feels more like a lead pipe filled with angry fire than a modern rifle. You are Miguel de Cervantes, or at least you're inhabiting his boots today, and you're currently a long way from the quiet library where we started. You're below deck, shivering under a wool blanket because you've caught a fever so high you can practically hear your own brain cells sizzling like bacon. Your captain told you to stay down, to rest, to let the able-bodied men handle the fighting. You probably wouldn't survive a 102-degree fever in a humid, rat-infested wooden box. But Miguel is different. He looks at his captain and tells him he'd rather die for God and the king than stay in the dark like Ackerward. It's a 16th century version of main character energy that borders on a death wish. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that the Battle of Lepanto was the last major naval conflict in history, fought almost entirely with rowing galleys. You feel the rhythmic, mechanical vibration beneath your feet, the sound of hundreds of galley slaves hitting the water with their oars in perfect, agonizing unison. Key thump, groan, key thump. It's a heavy, industrial percussion that would be soothing if you didn't know that the men pulling those oars were chained to their benches until they either won or drowned. You trudge up the narrow stairstone of the deck, and the light hits you like a physical blow. The Gulf of Patras eyes a swirling vortex of smoke and fire. To your left, a Venetian galley is being rammed by an Ottoman vessel, the sound of oak splintering sounding like 1,000 skeletons falling down a staircase. A quirky or fringe tidbit that military historians often gloss over is the vinegar tactic. To keep the massive bronze cannons from overheating and exploding into shrapnel, crews would constantly drench them in cold vinegar. As you walk across the deck, the air doesn't just smell like war. It smells like agient burning salad. You probably won't survive the combined fumes of sulfur and fermented wine. But for Miguel, it's just another Tuesday in the Holy League. You see the Ottoman flagship, the Sultana, emerging from the haze, its green banners flapping in the wind. The deck you're standing on is covered in sand, not for aesthetics, but to soak up the blood so the soldiers don't slip while they're trying to stab someone. It's toxic interior design at its finest. Historians still argue whether the victory at Lepanto actually saved Europe or if it was just a massive, expensive stalemate that didn't change the long-term balance of power. But as you stand there, watching a cloud of arrows rain down from the sky like a swarm of angry hornets, the big picture doesn't matter. All that matters is the guy across from you with a scimitar and a very determined look in his eye. You feel the heat of the sun on your back and the cold of the fever in your bones. Cervantes later wrote that this was the most sublime day of his life. He saw the world in high definition. The flash of the cannon, the glint of the Turkish armour, the way the sea turned from blue to a dark, bruised purple. You trudge into the thick of the boarding party. The Marquesas slammed into an enemy galley, and the peaceful bedtime vibe is officially dead. You are surrounded by the sound of Attabal drums, Ottoman war drums, beating out a frantic, intimidating rhythm. Boom tick boom, boom tick boom. It's the heartbeat of a conflict that has been simmering for centuries. Miguel is in the skiff section, the most exposed part of the ship. He's taking fire from all sides. You see him lift his arquebus, squinting through the stinging smoke. He isn't thinking about a novel about a crazy night. He isn't thinking about debt or prison. He is thinking about surviving the next 10 seconds. The air is thick with the clink, clink, clink of mail armour and the wet, heavy thuds of lead shot hitting wood. You feel a sudden white-hot jolt in your chest, and then another in your arm. The world tilts. The smoke seems to turn into a thick, grey blanket, wrapping around you and pulling you down toward the deck. This is where Miguel de Cervantes becomes the man who can write Don Quixote, not in the victory, but in the wounds. He would carry the scars of this day for the rest of his life, turning his shattered body into a monument of aglery that the rest of Spain was already starting to forget. As you lie there on the sand-covered planks, the sound of the battle begins to fade into a muffled underwater roar. You realize that while you might survive the battle, the man you were before you stepped onto this ship is gone forever, replaced by a soldier who knows exactly how much a dream can cost. You trudge into a consciousness that feels like it's been dragged through a gravel pit and then soaked in brine. The world is no longer a whirlwind of fire and vinegar. It is a dark, cramped space that smells of damp wool, rotting citrus, and the sharp antiseptic sting of cheap wine. You are lying in a hammock on a hospital galley, and the rhythm of the Mediterranean is no longer a war drum. It's a slow, nauseating sway. Creak sway, creak sway. It's the sound of the ship's timber complaining about the weight of the wounded. You probably won't survive this transition from hero to patient, at least not without a strong stomach and a complete lack of interest in what 16th century doctors call hygiene. You try to move your left arm, but it feels like it's been replaced by a heavy, throbbing log made of lead and regret. You look down, squinting through the dim light of a single flickering oil lamp swinging from a beam. Your hand is wrapped in layers of coarse linen that have turned a dark, rusty brown. This is the moment your life splits in two. Before today, you were a young man with working hands and a head full of bad poetry. Now, you are El Manco de Lepanto, the one-armed man of Lepanto. You probably wouldn't survive a modern visit where the doctor's primary tool is a hacksaw and a bottle of vinegar. But in 1571, this is what passes for high-end medical care. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that the arquebus, the weapon that did this to you, fired heavy, soft lead balls. When they hit bone, they didn't just pierce, they blossomed. They turned your wrist into a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces were missing and the other half were melting. You feel the heat radiating from the wound, a toxic fire that seems to be trying to eat its way up to your shoulder. The barber surgeons, remember those guys from part 1, have been busy. They've spent the last few hours lancing, digging for shrapnel with iron probes that haven't been cleaned since the last decade, and pouring boiling oil into the wounds to cauterize the infection. It's a 16th century wellness retreat that makes a root canal feel like a spa day, a quirky or fringe tidbit that military historians occasionally whisper about the use of honey dressings in Spanish naval hospitals. As you lie there, you can feel a strange, sticky sweetness seeping through the bandages. Someone has slathered your mangled hand in honey and wine, believing the sugar would draw out the evil humours. You probably won't survive the irony of being turned into a human dessert for the ship's flies. But for Miguel, this sticky mess is the only thing standing between him and a permanent appointment with a graveyard. You watch a single fly land on the edge of the linen, its wings buzzing in atony, irritating frequency that seems to vibrate right through your shattered nerves. Historians still argue whether Cervantes actually lost his hand entirely, or if it was just rendered useless and withered. The man himself was always a bit vague on the biological details, mostly because he was too busy bragging about it. He famously wrote that his left hand was slain for the greater glory of the right. Imagine being so committed to your personal brand that you treat a permanent disability like a prestigious trophy. You feel that pride now, event through the pain. It's a cold, hard lump in your chest. You've traded your mobility for a story, and in 1571 Spain, a story was often the only currency that didn't devalue overnight. You trudge through the hours of the long recovery in the port of Messina. The sound of the waves hitting the harbour wall is a constant, rhythmic slap-slop, slap-slop. It's a wet, repetitive ASMR that helps drown out the groans of the other 2,000 men in the hospital. You spend your days staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows of the rigging dance across the wood like ghostly puppets. Your left hand is starting to shrink. It's becoming a sorrowful appendage, a claw of stiffened tendons and scarred skin. You practice gripping a quill with your right hand, the wood feeling alien and clumsy. Scritch, scratch, blot. You probably wouldn't survive the frustration of relearning how to write while your other hand feels like it's being crushed in a vice. But Miguel is already starting to see the world through a new lens. The pain has a texture now. It's not just a sharp sting. It's a dull, vibrating hum that changes with the weather. When the humid Sirocco wind blows in from Africa, the scars tighten like a drumhead. When the cool night air settles over the galley, the bone-deep ache turns into a cold shiver. You realize that your body is no longer a tool. It's map of a single afternoon in the Gulf of Patras. Cervantes didn't just walk away from Lepanto. He carried Lepanto in his sleeve for the next 45 years. As you drift back into a feverish sleep, the sound of the harbour gulls, a high, lonely crying, sounds like the ghosts of the men who didn't make it to the hospital galley. You realize that while you might survive the infection, the hand of glory has ensured that you will never truly be at rest again. You are a soldier of a dying era, held together by honey, wine, and a stubborn refusal to let the pain be for nothing. You trudge out of the damp, medicinal shadows of the hospital at Messina, and for a moment the world is blindingly bright. The air is no longer thick with the scent of lanced boils and honeyed bandages. It's a crisp, sapphire blue morning on the Mediterranean in September 1575. You are standing on the deck of the galley Sol, and the rhythm of the sea is finally working in your favour. Slap hiss, slap hiss. It's the sound of the hull cutting through the waves like a hot knife through butter. You are heading home to Spain after nearly 5 years of campaigning, and you feel like a man who has finally beaten the house at a high-stakes game of don't die in a trench. You probably won't survive this level of optimism. History has a very specific way of humbling people who think they've already paid their dues. In your coat pocket, tucked safely against your ribs, are letters of recommendation from Don John of Austria and the Duke of Sessa. These pieces of paper are your golden ticket. They describe you as a soldier of great merit and a hero of Lepanto. You probably wouldn't survive a modern job interview with just a letter from a prince saying, "He's a good guy." But in the 16th century, these letters were the equivalent of a platinum credit card with an unlimited limit. They were meant to get you a captaincy or a cushy government job in Madrid. You pat the pocket, feeling the stiff parchment crinkle. You look at your left hand, that withered, sorrowful claw tucked into your sleeve, and you smile. It was worth it. The pain, the fever, the years of eating hardtack that had more weevils than grain. It's all about to pay off. You can almost smell thyrost lamb and clean sheets waiting for you in Alcalá. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that the Mediterranean in the 1570s was basically a lawless highway. It was the Wild West, but with more oars and fewer cowboys. The coastlines of North Africa were home to the Barbary corsairs, highly organised, state-sponsored pirates who viewed every European ship as a floating ATM. You are only a few days away from the coast of Catalonia. You can practically see the jagged purple outlines of the Spanish mountains on the horizon. But then, a lookout shouts from the mast, and the peaceful bedtime vibe is once again strangled in its sleep. 3 sails apart to the east, cutting through the morning mist. They aren't flying the banners of the Holy League. They are low, fast and lean, the greyhounds of the sea. They're the galleys of Dali Mami, a corsair captain known for his toxic temper and his very efficient approach to human trafficking. You feel the deck of the Sol begin to vibrate as the rowers are whipped into a frantic, suicidal pace. The sound of the oars hitting the water is a panicked, splashing stutter. Slap, 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 slap. It's a rhythmic ASMR of desperation. You probably won't survive the adrenaline dump that comes when you realize your luxury cruise home has just turned into a high-speed chase, where the prize is your own skin. Miguel reaches for his sword with his right hand, his left arm hanging uselessly. He is a soldier again. The fever of Lepanto is gone, replaced by the cold, vibrating clarity of a man who knows he is outnumbered 3-tone. You see the pirate ships closing in, their prows carving white scars into the blue water. A quirky or fringe tidbit that navigators of the era often noted was the scent of the corsair. Because pirate ships were packed so tightly with rowers and soldiers, and because they rarely docked for long, they allegedly carried a smell of rancid oil and unwashed bodies. that could be detected downwind before the ships were even visible. As the soul is intercepted, the air doesn't just smell like salt anymore. It smells like the heavy, suffocating musk of an empire that views you as cargo. Dali Mami's flagship slams into the side of the soul with a sound like a forest being crushed by a giant. Crack, boom. Splintered wood flies through the air like lethal toothpicks. You probably won't survive the splinter spray, but Miguel is Aussie on his feet, trying to organize a defense that he knows is doomed. Historians still argue whether the soul could have escaped if the wind had shifted, or if the captain had made a different tactical choice. Some say it was a mercy capture, meaning the pirates were more interested in the ransom than the slaughter. But, as you stand on the deck, watching the corsairs swarm over the railings like a tide of dark wool and gleaming steel, mercy is the last word on your mind. You feel the heavy thudding impact of pirate boots on the Spanish deck. The air is full of the clash-clash-clink of blades meeting and the sharp, popping sounds of small arms fire. Miguel is fighting with one hand, a quixotic struggle against a reality that is far more brutal than any romance novel. He is surrounded. A pirate captain with a beard like a burnt bush points a scimitar at his throat and barks an order in a language that sounds like grinding stones. This is the moment the toxic nature of his luck truly reveals itself. Theperates find those letters of recommendation in his pocket, the ones from Don John of Austria. Ironically, these letters, which were supposed to be his ticket to a better life, become his heaviest chains. Dali Mami looks at the papers and sees the signature of the king's brother. He doesn't see a poor soldier. He sees a high-value aristocrat. He thinks he's captured a Spanish grandee. This means your ransom isn't going to be a few hundred ducats. It's going to be a king's ransom. It's the 16th century version of having your identity stolen, and through thief maxing out your credit limit before you even get to the bank. You trudge into the hold of the pirate galley, but this time you are in chains, the sound of the iron links rattling against each other. Chink shiver is the new soundtrack to your life. You are pushed down into a dark, humid space that smells of bilge water and old fear. You probably wouldn't survive a commute in a space this cramped. But for Miguel, this is the beginning of a 5-year nightmare. As the pirate ship turns south, away from the Spanish coast and toward the whitewashed walls of Algiers, you look through a tiny porthole and watch your home disappear into the haze. The sun has officially set on your freedom. You realize that while you survived the battle, the letters of glory have ensured that you are now a prisoner of your own reputation. You are a man with a useless hand, a pocketful of useless paper, and a horizon that is no longer purple, but a stark, unforgiving white. You trudge off the gangplank of the pirate galley and onto the scorching, sun-bleached stone of the Algiers docks. The transition is violent. One moment you are wrapped in the damp, rotting wood silence of the ship's hold, and then next, you are slapped in the face by a wall of heat that smells like jasmine, grilled sardines, and the sweat of 20,000 captive souls. It is late 1575, and you are currently experiencing the ultimate 16th century cultural exchange program, except you didn't sign up for it, and the dormitory is a stone prison called a bagnio. You probably won't survive the sheer visual overload of this place. Algiers is known as the White City, rising up the hillside like a jagged staircase of chalk and limestone, so bright under the North African sun that it actually hurts to look at. It's like being trapped inside a giant burning opal. Your boots, those same dusty La Mancha boots that have now been soaked in Mediterranean blood and pirate bilge, drag across the quay. You feel the weight of the iron shackles around your ankles. They aren't the heavy, cinematic chains you see in movies. They are thin, biting rings of cold iron connected by a short chain that forces you to walk with a rhythmic, shuffling skip. Chink scrape, chink scrape. It's a metallic ASMR that tells everyone within a 3-block radius that you are currently property. You probably wouldn't survive a modern morning commute if your ankles were literally vibrating with the sound of your own lack of freedom. But for Miguel, this clinking is just the new tempo of his heart. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that Algiers in the late 16th century was one of the most cosmopolitan and terrifying cities on the planet. It was a corsair state, a buzzing hub of trade, where human beings were the primary currency. At any given time, there were roughly 25,000 to 30,000 European slaves living within these white walls. You trudge through the Zoko, the market, and the sensory input is toxic in its intensity. You see merchants in silk caftans, janissaries with mustaches that look like they require a dedicated mountain crew, and fellow captives from every corner of the map. Venetians, Frenchmen, Germans, and Greeks. It's the 16th century version of an international airport lounge, but everyone is miserable and the security has scimitars. You are led away from the bright chaos of the market and into the bagnio of Dali Mami, a quirky or fringe tidbit that often escapes the history books' origin of that name. Bagnio is the Italian word for bath. These prisons were often converted public bathhouses or warehouses, which meant they had vaulted stone ceilings and terrible acoustics. As you step into the shadows of the bagnio, the air turns cool and damp, smelling of old stone and unwashed wool. You feel the silence of the prison. It's a heavy silence, layered with the whispered prayers of men who have forgotten what their mothers' voices sound like. You find a spot on a reed mat that feels like it's made of dried thorns. This is your suite. You probably won't survive a night on a mattress that doubles as a localized ecosystem for fleas, but Miguel just sits there, his withered left hand tucked into his vest, watching the shadows of the iron bars across the floor. Historians still argue whether Cervantes' captivity was as brutally theatrical as he described it in his later plays and novels, or if he was treated with a weird kind of business-like respect because of his high ransom value. Remember those letters of recommendation from Don John of Austria? They have turned you into a high-stakes slave. You aren't sent to pull an oar or grind grain. You are kept in the bagnio like a valuable piece of vintage jewellery that the owner is waiting to sell. You are special, which in Algiers means you are guarded twice as closely, and your ransom is set at 500 gold ducats, a price your family in Spain couldn't pay if they sold every tooth in their heads. You feel the crushing irony of it. You are a hero of Lepanto, a man of great merit, and that merit is the very thing keeping you in chains. It's the original success as a prison metaphor, but with much more actual iron involved. The daily routine in the bagnio has a rhythmic, soul-crushing predictability. You wake to the sound of a wooden mallet hitting a bronze plate, gong gong gong, a sound that vibrates through the stone floor and right into your molars. Breakfast is a handful of black olives and a piece of pita bread so hard you could use it as a defensive weapon. You spend your hours in the courtyard, watching the calligraphy of the sky through the overhead grates. Miguel, ever the storyteller, becomes the social director of the prison. He tells stories, he recites poetry. He keeps the other men from sliding into the toxic swamp of despair. You probably wouldn't survive being the office entertainer in a literal dungeon. But for Miguel, language is the only thing the corsairs can't shackle. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean, casting a blood-red glow over the white city, you listen to the distant call to prayer from the minarets. A long melodic crying that seems to float over the walls and settle in the courtyard. It's a beautiful sound, but for you it's a reminder that you are on the wrong side of the water. You feel the cold of the stone walls seeping into your bones, and the ache in your withered hand starts its nightly vibration. Cervantes didn't just survive Algiers, he studied it. He learned the rhythm of his captors, the logic of the chains, and the terrifying realization that a man can be physically bound but mentally infinite. As you drift into a fitful sleep, the sound of the prison gate being bolted, a heavy, final clunk sure thud, reminds you that while the dream of La Mancha is still years away, the man who will write it is being forged in the dark. Link by agonizing link, you trudge out of the suffocating, vaulted echoes of the bagnio and into the blinding crystalline brilliance of a North African garden. The air here is a toxic cocktail of sensory contradictions. It smells of blooming orange blossoms and sweet jasmine, but beneath that perfume is the sharp, acrid scent of dry manure and the salt-crusted humidity of the nearby sea. You are standing in the middle of a private estate outside the city walls of Algiers, and for the first time in 2 years, you aren't staring at a stone ceiling. You probably won't survive this transition to the outdoors, not because of the heat, but because the sudden sight of a wide blue horizon is enough to give a prisoner a lethal case of hope which is the most dangerous disease in the 16th century. You are Miguel de Cervantes, and you have just been promoted because your ransom is so high and because you keep telling stories that make the other prisoners think they're in a palace instead of a pit. Your master has decided to put you to work in his garden. You feel the grit of the Mediterranean sand inside your boots, the same boots that have now walked through the dust of La Mancha, the blood of Lepanto, and the filth of a pirate galley. Your left hand, that withered, sorrowful claw, is tucked into your belt, while your right hand grips a heavy iron spade. Shrek, shrek. It's a rhythmic, metallic ASMR, the sound of a soldier trying to pretend he's a gardener. But you aren't digging for turnips. You are digging for a miracle. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that Cervantes was not a passive prisoner. He was a serial escape artist. Over 5 years, he organized 4 massive high-stakes escape attempts, any one of which should have ended with him being impaled on a city gate. You trudge toward the far edge of the garden, where the lemon trees grow thick and tangled, casting long striped shadows across the reed earth. You are looking for a specific spot, a hidden entrance to a natural sea cave carved into the cliffside. Over the last few months, you've been secretly moving fellow Spanish captives into this toxic hole in the ground. You probably wouldn't survive a weekend camping trip in a damp, salt-slicked cave with 14 other unwashed men. But Miguel has turned this cavern into a sanctuary of resistance. You feel the cool, damp air rising from the cave mouth as you pull back a screen of dry brush. The sound of the waves below is a muffled, rhythmic thumping, boom hiss, vibrating through the soles of your feet. You slip inside, and the peaceful bedtime vibe is replaced by the tenets, vibrating silence of men who are holding their breath. 14 of your countrymen are sitting in the dark, their eyes glowing like marbles in the dim light. They've been here for 6 months, living on bread you've smuggled in your pockets and the sheer, quixotic belief that a rescue ship is coming. A quirky or fringe tidbit that historians love to bring up is the role of Cervantes' brother, Rodrigo. While Miguel was trapped in Algiers, his brother was actually ransomed first. Instead of just going home and forgetting about Miguel, Rodrigo spent every cent the family had to arm a private galley and sail it back to the Algiers coast to pick up Miguel and the men in the cave. You imagine the sound of that ship in the distance, the rhythmic clack-clack of Spanish oars cutting through the night water. You probably won't survive the heartbreak of what happens next. But as you stand at the cave's mouth, watching for a signal fire, you see the Spanish ship approach and then turn around. A passing corsair patrol spotted them. The rescue failed by a matter of yards and a few minutes of bad luck. The silence that follows that failed rescue is heavy. It's the kind of silence that breaks men. But Miguel doesn't break. He trudges back to the bagnio, his mind already spinning a new plot. Historians still argue whether Cervantes was spared from execution after these attempts because of his high ransom value, or because the Pasha of Algiers, Hassan Pasha, had a weird, grudging respect for the maimed Spaniard's courage. Hassan Pasha famously said that as long as he had the one-armed soldier in his power, his city and his slaves were safe. It's the 16th century equivalent of being the most dangerous man in the office, but your boss won't fire you because you're the only one who knows how to fix the printer. You trudge through the final months of your captivity in 1580. The ransom has finally been collected, not by the king, and not by the Duke of Sessa, but by the Trinitarian monks who travelled door to door in Spain begging for copper coins. You feel the weight of the gold ducats being counted out on a wooden table. Clink, clink, clink. It's a rhythmic, financial ASMR that sounds like freedom. You are led to the docks one last time. The shackles are removed, and the toxic bite of the iron on your ankles finally stops vibrating. As you step onto the ship that will take you back to Spain, you look back at the white city of Algiers. You are 33 years old. You have a useleshand, a chest full of lead, and 5 years of chains in your memory. You probably won't survive the irony of returning to a country that has almost entirely forgotten who you are. But as you listen to the snap of the sails, whip, snap, you realize that you aren't the same man who left. Thessalgier is dead, and the prisoner is fading. But the writer has just been born. You trudge toward the prow, looking toward the horizon of La Mancha, ready to turn the scars of Lepanto and the chains of Algiers into astery that will live forever. You trudge into a room that feels like it's been marinating in a toxic slurry of old leather, drying ink, and the frantic electric hum of a mind that has officially disconnected from the terrestrial grid. We are back in that dusty library in La Mancha, but the air is different now. It's no longer just stagnant, it's vibrating. It's the year 1605, and you are currently standing in the workspace of Alonso Quijano, who has spent the last several weeks performing a slow motion magic trick. He is turning himself into a ghost. You probably won't survive this level of literary immersion, not because the books will fall on you, but because the sheer, unadulterated madness radiating from this man is powerful enough to make you start checking your own kitchen for magic swords. You watch him now, huddled over a volume of Feliciano da Silva. The candle on his desk is a guttering, wax-spattered stump, its flame performing a jitterdance that casts spindly shadows against the walls, shadows that look suspiciously like knights with drawn lances. The sound in the room is a rhythmic, hypnotic ASMR of obsession, the dry, papery shusher of page sturning, the wet slurp of a quill being dipped into an inkwell, and the raspy, shallow breathing of a man who has forgotten that food and water are generally considered essential for human life. He is drying up his brain, as the text tells us, and you can almost hear the grey matter crackling like parchment under a magnifying glass. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that the romances of chivalry were the video games and superhero movies of the Spanish Golden Age. They were addictive, highly stylized, and utterly detached from the reality of 17th century life. While the Spanish Empire was busy defaulting on its debts and losing its grip on the New World, its citizens were obsessed with stories of the Knight of the Burning Sword and the Knight of the Rose. It was a cultural coping mechanism, a way to ignore the stinking gutters and the tax collectors by retreating into a world of enchanted castles and noble giants. Alonso isn't just reading these stories. He's downloading them directly into his subconscious. He's the first person in history to suffer from main character syndrome on a clinical level, a quirky or fringe tidbit that early literary critics used to argue about is the physical nature of Quijano's library. Some suggest that the books of chivalry weren't just bad for his mind, but literally toxic for his body. Many of these books were printed using lead-based inks and bound in leathers tanned with arsenic or other heavy chemicals. As Alonso spends his nights huffing the scent of these decomposing pages in a small, unventilated room, he might actually be suffering from chronic heavy metal poisoning. Imagine the irony. The world's greatest work of literature being born because a man spent too much time breathing in the fumes of his own bookshelf. You probably won't survive a literary detox that requires you to stop inhaling your own paperbacks. But for Alonso, the ink is his only reality. Historians still argue whether Alonso's madness was meant to be a literal portrayal of melancholy, a specific medical diagnosis of the time involving an excess of black bile, or if he was a voluntary madman, a man who chose to go insane because the real world was simply too depressing to inhabit. You feel that choice in the air. It's a heavy kind of madness. He looks at his withered left hand, the one that Miguel de Cervantes gave him as a callback to his own scars at Lepanto, and he doesn't see a broken appendage. He sees a badge of honor. He is ready to trade his sanity for a world where giants are real and love is a holy quest. You move closer to him, and you see the moment the trap finally snaps shut. He reaches a passage about a knight who stays awake for 3 days in a desert. Andy nods, his eyes bloodshot and wide. Scritch, scratch. He marks the margin with a fingernail. He has decided. He isn't just a reader anymore. He is a participant. You watch him stand up, his joints creaking like the hinges of a dungeon door. The library of paper is about to become a world of iron. As He blows out the candle, the room is plunged into a blue, moonlit darkness that smells of cold ash and ancient promises. You realize that while you might survive the night in this library, the man named Alonso Quijano is gone. In his place is a knight-errant, ready to walk into the dust of La Mancha and treat the entire world as if it were a poorly edited manuscript. You trudge into a space where the ceiling is so low it feels like the house is trying to whisper in your ear. The air here isn't vibrating with mental energy anymore. It's thick, heavy, and smells of toxic neglect, a cocktail of mouse droppings, ancient cobwebs, and the biting orange scent of oxidizing iron. You are standing in the attic storeroom of Alonso Quijano's house, a place where things go to be forgotten until they eventually turn into dust. But tonight, nothing is being forgotten. You are currently witnessing the birth of a legend, though right now, it looks more like a man having a very intense breakdown in a pile of family trash. You probably won't survive this level of DIY enthusiasm, not because of the danger, but because the sound of metal being scraped against stone is enough to set your teeth on edge and keep them there for the next 3 centuries. You watch Don Quixote now. He's no longer Alonso, remember. He's shed that name like a snake, shedding a boring middle-aged skin. He is kneeling on the floor, surrounded by pieces of armor that belonged to his great-grandfather. This isn't the gleaming, cinematic steel of a movie poster. This is iron that has been marinating in a humid attic since the early 1500s. It's covered in a thick, velvety coat of rust that looks like burnt cinnamon. The sound in the room is a rhythmic, grinding ASMR. The sure scrape of a piece of old felt and a handful of sand being used to scour the metal. You probably wouldn't survive a modern weekend project that involves manually sanding 300 pounds of jagged iron, but Quixote is moving with the steady, unblinking focus of a man who believes he is polishing his own soul. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that by 1605, the kind of full-plate armor Quixote was obsessed with was basically a museum piece. We were firmly in the age of the arquebus and the musket. Remember the lead balls that ruined Miguel's hand in Part 2. Putting on a suit of 15th century iron to go into a 17th century fight was like trying to win a modern Formula One race in a horse-drawn carriage. It was heavy, it was hot, and it was entirely useless against gunpowder. But to the knight, this isn't just protection, it's a uniform. You pass him a greave, the part that covers the shin, and it feels like holding a very cold, very heavy stovepipe. You probably won't survive the irony of a man protecting himself against enchanters, using technology that was already obsolete when his grandfather was a toddler. A quirky or fringe tidbit that military historians occasionally discuss is the physical toxicity of wearing old, unmaintained armor. Because the leather straps were often cured with heavy salts and the interior padding was a haven for lice and fleas, putting on these pieces was basically like inviting a skin infection to a formal dinner. Some scholars suggest that the chafing of the mittel and the weight on his gaunt spine contributed to Quixote's irritability and further brain drying. Imagine trying to be a noble hero while your armpits are being pinched by rusted hinges and a family of spiders is currently relocating into your breastplate. It's a 17th century version of wearing iron pajamas that haven't been washed since the fall of Granada. You probably wouldn't survive a single mile in this getup without calling for a physical therapist and a tetanus shot. Historians still argue whether the cardboard visor incident was meant by Cervantes as a metaphor for the fragile state of the Spanish Empire, or just a brilliant piece of slapstick comedy. You watch as Quixote realizes that his helmet, a simple morion or headpiece, is missing its face protection. He doesn't go to a blacksmith. He reaches for a scrap of cardboard he found in a corner. He cuts it, folds it, and attaches it with some green ribbon. To test it, he draws his sword and gives it a healthy whack. Thwack. The cardboard shatters instantly. He doesn't sigh. He doesn't quit. He simply remakes it, this time lining the inside with small iron strips, and decides not to test it again. It's the ultimate don't ask, don't tell policy for equipment safety. As far as he's concerned, if he believes it's steel, then steel it shall be. You move closer to the pile of gear, and you see him try to buckle the breastplate. The leather straps are dry, they sound like snapping twigs. Crack, snap. He mends them with bits of twine and old rope, creating a look that is less Lancelot and more eccentric scavenger. The clanking sound of him moving, clink-clatter, bang, vibrates through the floorboards. It's a clumsy, metallic percussion that should be annoying, but in the dim moonlight, it starts to sound like a rhythmic heartbeat. He is assembling a dream out of scraps. You see him lift the finished helmet and place it on his head. The cardboard visor is a bit lopsided, and the green ribbons are fluttering in the draft, but when he looks at you, his eyes are full of a terrifying crystalline clarity. The attic room seems to shrink around him. The rusted iron is no longer trash. It is the harness of a hero. The twine and cardboard are no longer repairs. They are enchanted reinforcements. You feel the weight of his transformation. It's the sound of a man deciding that if the world won't give him a legend, he'll build one out of the things the world threw away. He stands up, swaying slightly under the 50 pounds of metal, and you follow him as he clanks his way down the stairs. The cardboard knight is ready to face the horizon. As Hess steps out into the yard where Rocinante is waiting, the sound of his armour, as low rhythmic clank clank clank, reminds you that while you might survive the night, the reality of La Mancha is about to be hit by a man who refuses to believe in it. You trudge into a world that has been scrubbed raw by a relentless grey drizzle, the kind of rain that doesn't just fall, but seems to seep directly to your pores, turning your clothes into a toxic, leaden weight that drags at your spirit. The air here smells of wet donkey fur, damp wool, and the sharp mineral scent of rain-beaten flint. You are walking along a narrow winding track in the Sierra Morena, following a man on a skeletal horse, who is currently wearing a cardboard and iron costume that is becoming increasingly soggy. You probably won't survive this level of atmospheric dampness. Not because you'll melt, but because the sound of water dripping off a rusted breastplate is a rhythmic, metallic torture that sounds like a clock counting down to your next head cold. Suddenly, the rain begins to slacken, and a single, defiant beam of sunlight stabs through the clouds, hitting the road ahead. You see a figure approaching on a mule, a man who looks like he's just trying to get through his Tuesday without getting soaked. He is wearing something on his head that catches the light and throws it back with a blinding golden intensity. To you, it's our village barber who has put his brass shaving basin over his hat to keep it dry. To Don Quixote, it is the legendary helmet of Mambrino, a magical artifact once belonging to a Moorish king, which supposedly makes the wearer invincible. You probably wouldn't survive a high-speed collision with a man who thinks his kitchenware is a nuclear deterrent. But Quixote is already lowering his lance and spurring Rocinante into a mud-spraying gallop. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that in 1605, the barber surgeon was the closest thing a Spanish village had to a walk-in clinic. These men were the keepers of the basin, a specific brass tool with a semicircle cut out of the rim so it could be held snugly against a customer's neck. It was used for two things: catching lather during a shave and catching blood during a letting. You feel the cold utilitarian reality of that object as it flies through the air. The barber, seeing a gaunt man in rusted iron charging at him like a guided missile, does the only sensible thing. He jumps off his mule and runs into the bushes, leaving his basin behind in the mud. You watch as Quixote picks it up with the trembling reverence of a man discovering the Holy Grail. A quirky or fringe tidbit that social historians often point out is that a brass basin was actually a significant investment for a 17th century tradesman. Brass was expensive, often imported from the factories of Nuremberg or the Low Countries. For that barber, losing that basin was like a modern freelancer having their laptop smashed by a guy in a suit of armour. As Quixote wipes the mud off the brass, the sound is a rhythmic, ringing ASMR, the ping-ting of his gloved fingers tapping the metal to check for enchantment. You probably won't survive the cognitive dissonance of watching a man put a shaving bowl on his head and declare himself a god, but for Quixote, the ping of the brass is the sound of destiny calling him on his 17th century Bluetooth headset. Historians still argue whether Quixote is truly hallucinating, or if he is engaging in a sophisticated form of voluntary self-hypnosis. Does he actually see a golden helmet, or does he see a basin and simply decide that reality is wrong? You feel that tension in the way he handles the object. He notices the huge hole in the rim, the part meant for the barber's neck, and concludes that some ignorant person must have melted down the other half for the gold. He doesn't see a defect, he sees a tragedy. He puts it on, lopsided and ridiculous, the brass reflecting the pale sun like a satellite dish for madness. He looks at Sancho Panza, who is trying very hard not to point out that his master currently looks like a very confused turtle, and he barks an order to keep moving. You move closer to the night, and you see the water beads rolling off the brass rim. Plip, plip, plip. The sound hits his iron shoulder guards with a dull, hollow resonance. He is now fully equipped in his own mind. He has the armour of his ancestors, a horse named for the best of the nags, and a magical helmet stolen from a man who is currently hiding in a ditch. The absurdity of his silhouette against the wide, indifferent sky is almost overwhelming. He is a man who has successfully colonized reality, turning a rainy road into a stage for epic poetry. You probably wouldn't survive a fashion critique from these villagers, but Quixote doesn't care about their eyes. He only cares about the eyes of history. The road continues to climb, and the scent of the rain-washed thyme fills your lungs. You see the knight adjust the basin, his chin strap, made of more green ribbon, fluttering in the wind. The basin of Mambrino is now part of the myth. You feel the weight of his conviction. It's the sound of a world where everything has a double meaning. A basin is a helmet, a mule is a steed, a beating is a trial. You follow him as he rides further into the Sierra Morena, the rhythmic clack-clink of his boots and the brass helmet, creating a bizarre metallic lullaby. He is a hero of his own making, held together by rusted iron and the sheer refusal to believe that a shaving dish is just a shaving dish. The sun dips lower, casting a long, spindly shadow of a knight, with a bowl on his head across the Spanish earth. You realize that while you might survive the rain, you are now a prisoner of a dream that is far more durable than the metal that carries it. You trudge along a path that feels like it was paved with broken expectations and baked in the oven of a merciless Spanish summer. The cool, damp resin of the Sierra Morena is a distant memory now, replaced by the parched, shimmering air off the road to Toboso. Your skin is coated in a toxic glaze of sweat and fine-height lime dust that makes you look like you've been lightly breaded for a deep fryer. You are walking behind a knight who is currently high on the fumes of his own imagination, still wearing that brass shaving basin like it's a crown of glory. You probably won't survive this particular leg of the journey, not because of bandits, but because the smell of drying sun-baked earth mixed with the sharp, aggressive pungency of raw garlic is enough to hijack your central nervous system and take it on a one-way trip to a headache. You are heading toward the village of El Toboso, the supposed home of the Empress of La Mancha, Dulcinea. You feel the rhythm of the road, the steady, dry crunch scuff of your boots, and the rhythmic, laboured breathing of Rocinante. Don Quixote is silent, his face set in an expression of such intense, holy devotion that you'd think he was approaching the gates of heaven rather than a small dusty town known mostly for its grain production. He is looking for a vision of musk and lilies, a lady whose hands are as white as snow, and whose voice is like a silver bell. You probably wouldn't survive a date with a vision, mostly because the maintenance on an imaginary girlfriend is surprisingly expensive in terms of sanity. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that 17th century rural Spain was an agrarian society, where beauty was a luxury few could afford. Most women in villages like Toboso were not sitting in velvet chairs embroidering silk. They were in the fields, winnowing wheat, tending to livestock, and getting their hands stained with the black juice of olives and the red clay of the earth. You pass a well where a group of women are hauling heavy ceramic jars, Their arms are muscular, their skin is tanned to the colour of a well-worn saddle, and they aren't wearing diadems of pearls. They're wearing coarse hemp headscarves. This is the reality that Quixote is about to collide with, and it's going to be a bone-jarring impact. A quirky or fringe tidbit that social historians love to explore is the garlic divide of the Spanish Golden Age. Garlic was the absolute staple of the peasant diet. It was cheap, it kept forever, and it made the meagre portions of bread and oil taste like something. But for the Spanish elite, garlic was considered toxic to the social status. They believed its smell was the literal scent of poverty. To say a woman smelled of garlic was the 1605 equivalent of a one-star review on a dating app. You feel the weight of this as you enter the outskirts of Toboso. The air doesn't smell like perfume. It smells like 1,000 cloves of garlic being crushed at once. It's the original Axe body spray of the working class, and it's currently filling your nostrils with vibrating, spicy hum. Historians still argue whether Dulcinea was based on a real woman Cervantes knew, perhaps a local girl named Aldonza Lorenzo who was famous for her skill at salting pork, or if she was entirely a figment of Quixote's library-induced delirium. You see Sancho Panza looking nervous. He knows there is no empress. He knows that Aldonza Lorenzo is a brawny girl who can throw a bar of iron as well as any man in the village. You probably wouldn't survive an arm wrestling match with the real Dulcinea, but Quixote is currently applying a 17th century Instagram filter to his entire reality. He sees a peasant girl riding a donkey, and through the enchantment of his mind, she becomes a princess on a white palfrey. You move closer to the village square, and you see the knight stop Rocinante, eyes trembling. He sees 3 peasant girls approaching on donkeys, laughing and shouting in voices that sound like gravel being poured into a tin bucket. To you, they are loud, overworked teenagers with sun-cracked lips and dust in their hair. To Quixote, they are a vision of celestial beauty. Sancho, desperate to keep the enchanted narrative going, falls to his knees and tells his master that the Empress is approaching. You watch as Quixote looks at the girl Sancho points to, a girl who is currently wiping her nose on her sleeve and smells so strongly of garlic that the flies are giving her a wide berth. You probably won't survive the awkwardness of this encounter. Quixote is confused. He doesn't see the princess. He sees the peasant. He concludes once again that he has been enchanted by his enemies. He believes the wizard Freston has stolen his vision and replaced it with this stinking, garlic-breathing reality just to torture him. You see the heartbreak in his gaunt face. It's a heavy kind of sadness. He apologizes to the girl for not recognizing her true form through the enchantment. The girl, meanwhile, thinks she's a dangerous weirdo and tells him to get out of the way before she knocks his teeth out. The Lady of the Heart has officially entered the myth, but the scent of the encounter lingers on your clothes. As you walk away from Toboso, leaving the garlic-scented breeze behind, the knight is more determined than ever to break the spell. You follow him as he heads back toward the open road, his lopsided brass helmet catching the dying light of the sun. You feel the weight of his delusion. It's the sound of a world that is trying to tell him he's wrong, while he uses that very rejection to prove he's a hero. As the moon rises, a cold, white basin in the sky that reminds you of the barber's basin we polished in the attic. You realize that while you might survive the toxic smells of the village, the Lady of Toboso is now a permanent ghost in the knight's machine, a garlic-scented rose that will drive him until the very end. You trudge out of the garlic-heavy atmosphere of El Toboso, and for a moment, the world feels impossibly wide and dangerously empty. The narrow, judgmental streets of the village have surrendered to the vast, parched infinity of the Spanish plateau. The air here is a toxic mix of shimmering heat waves and thiedery, flinty scent of a landscape that hasn't seen a significant cloud since the reign of Philip II. You are walking behind a skeletal horse named Rocinante, and the rhythm of the journey has shifted from the frantic chaos of Toboso into Aslo, bone-deep vibration. Clack, clink, clack, clink. It's the sound of 4 hooves hitting sun-baked earth and 1 rusted breastplate hitting a brass basin helmet. You probably won't survive this level of boredom, not because of a lack of action, but because the silence of La Mancha at noon is so heavy it feels like it's trying to press you directly into the dirt. You are currently enjoying the skeletal gallop which is a polite way of saying you are riding a horse that has the structural integrity of a collapsed umbrella. You feel the heat of the sun on your neck, a relentless golden pressure that makes your rough collar feel like a circle of smouldering hay. Don Quixote sits tall in his saddle, his eyes fixed on a horizon that is perfectly flat and entirely unimpressed by his presence. To him, this road isn't just a path through the weeds. It is a theatre of glory, a place where every dusty turn could reveal a kingdom or a giant. You probably wouldn't survive a road trip without a GPS or a podcast, but Quixote is currently listening to a podcast narrated by the voices in his own head, and it's been playing on a loop for 300 miles. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that the roads of 17th century Spain were some of the most toxic and dangerous in Europe, but not for the reasons Quixote thinks. They weren't filled with enchanters. They were filled with the Mesta, the powerful guild of sheep owners, who had the legal right to drive millions of sheep across the country on dedicated cañadas reales or royal sheep paths. You trudge through a section of the road where the grass has been eaten down to the nub by a moving sea of wool. The smell is a thick, humid musk of lanolin and manure. You probably won't survive the irony of a knight-errant looking for a dragon and finding only 10,000 confused merinos. Thessy sheep paths were the superhighways of the era, and they kept Spain's economy moving even as the rest of the country started to feel like a ghost town. A quirky or fringe tidbit that Cervantes fans often debate is the actual biology of Rocinante. The name itself is a 17th century pun. Rocin meant a low-quality workhorse, and ante meant before or formerly. So his name literally means the nag who used to be first. He is the original project car of horses, a vehicle that was once okay but is now held together by sheer willpower and maybe a little bit of spite. As you watch the horse's ears twitch, the sound is a rhythmic, leathery flicking, flup-flup. You probably won't survive their realization that your steed of legend is essentially a hide-covered xylophonet requires a very patient squire to keep it moving in a straight line. Historians still argue whether Don Quixote's constant riding was meant as a parody of the great pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, the famous Camino. Is Quixote a holy pilgrim, or a man who is literally walking in circles because he's lost his map? You feel that circularity as you look at the landscape. It's a heavy kind of sameness. Every olive tree looks like the one you passed an hour ago. Every dry creek bed looks like a scar on the face of the earth. You probably wouldn't survive a day of this without checking your step counter and crying. But Miguel de Cervantes spent years on these roads as a travelling tax collector, and he knew every rhythmic thump of a mule's foot and every creak of a leather saddle. He didn't write this from a palace. He wrote it from the perspective of a man whose boots were permanently sustained with the white lime of the highway. You move closer to the night, and you see the way the heat makes the air around his lopsided brass basin shimmer. The helmet of Mambrino is catching the white light of the sun and reflecting it into your eyes like a laser. You feel the vibrating silence of the plains. Occasionally, a cicada breaks the quiet with a high-pitched, metallic scream. Zzz, a sound that vibrates right in the center of your forehead. Quixote doesn't flinch. He is in a trance of chivalry. He is composing a speech to Dulcinea, his voice a low, dry murmur that sounds like wind moving through dead cornstalks. He is a man who has successfully escaped the cage of his village, but he has entered a much larger cage. The cage of the open road, where the horizon never gets any closer no matter how fast you gallop. The sun begins to dip, turning the parched yellow fields into a sea of bruised gold and long purple shadows. The skeletal gallop is finally slowing down as Rocinante decides that he's done with the concept of forward motion for the day. You trudge toward a small cluster of cork trees, the bark peeling away in thick, spongy layers that smell of damp wood and ancient dust. You feel the weight of the day. It's a stiff kind of exhaustion as the knight dismounts. The sound of his armor clanking against the saddle, sounding like a sack of silver spoons falling down a well. You realize that while you might survive the boredom of La Mancha, the road has a way of changing you. It strips away the official version of who you are and replaces it with the person you become when no one is watching. As the first stars begin to poke through the indigo sky, looking like tiny, hitting rivets in a cosmic suit of armor, You follow the night into the shadows, a witness to a quest that is going nowhere fast, but doing it with the most beautiful broken rhythm in the history of the world. You trudge toward a flickering yellow light that is currently struggling to exist against the vast ink-black throat of a Castilian night. The cool, resinous breath of the Sierra Morena mountains has been replaced by a toxic cocktail of sensory assaults as you approach a low rectangular building hunkered down in the dirt like a wounded animal. This is a Venta, a 17th century roadside inn, and to anyone with a functioning set of eyes, it is a high-definition nightmare of grime and neglect. But to Don Quixote, who is currently adjusting his lopsided brass basin and squinting into the gloom, those scrumbling mud brick walls are the ramparts of a mighty fortress, and the smell of rancid olive oil and unwashed muleteers is the perfume of Arabian spices. You probably won't survive this level of hospitality, not because of a duel, but because the sanitation standards here are essentially a suggestion that everyone stopped following in the Middle Ages. You step across the threshold, and the air hits you like a physical weight. It is heavy, with the scent of burning holm oak, damp straw that has seen too many seasons, and the sharp, vinegary tang of wine that has been sitting in a pigskin bag for far too long. Your boots, now practically a part of your feet after weeks on the road, sink into a floor covered in a layer of rushes and old dirt that feels like walking on a very grimy sponge. To your left, a group of muleteers are huddled around a fire, their faces lit from below like gargoyles in a cathedral. The sound in the room is a rhythmic industrial ASMR, thruck-clack, crack of a wooden spit being turned by a soot-stained boy, and the low, wet slurp-slap of men eating a stew that looks like it was made from things found under a rock. You probably wouldn't survive a modern health inspection in this place, but in 1605, this Venta is the only thing standing between you and a cold night in a ditch with the wolves. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that roadside inns in Golden Age Spain were notoriously toxic and dangerous places. They were unregulated, lawless zones where the innkeeper was often in league with local bandits, and the beds were usually just space on the floor in a shared attic. You pass a staircase that groans under your weight. Error creak, error snap, a sound that vibrates right through your shins. You see the castle keeper, the innkeeper, a man whose skin looks like it's been cured in wood smoke, and whose eyes are constantly calculating how many maravedis he can squeeze out of your pockets before dawn. He greets Don Quixote with a sarcastic bow, playing along with the knightly delusion, because he knows the knight has a squire with a purse full of coins. A quirky or fringe tidbit that social historians often dig up is the wineskin reality of the Spanish road. Wine wasn't kept in glass bottles back then. It was stored in odres, which were entire pigskins turned inside out and treated with pitch or resin to keep them airtight. As you watch a man lift a wineskin and squeeze a jet of dark red liquid into his mouth, the sound is a rhythmic leathery squish-glug. Squish-glug, you probably won't survive the taste. That toxic pitch gave the wine a flavour that most travellers described as drinking a campfire through a dirty boot. But for Sancho Panza, who is currently eyeing the pigskins with the longing of a man in a desert, that pitchy, bitter wine is the only thing that makes the knight's speeches about giant slaying tolerable. Historians still argue whether Cervantes intended these ventas to represent a miniature version of a chaotic, disorganised Spain, or if he was simply exercising his own heavy memories of travelling the country as a failed tax collector. You feel that exhaustion in the room. It's in the way the travellers, a mix of itinerant merchants, soldiers returning from the wars in Flanders, and friars with mud-caked sandals, all keep one hand on their daggers even while they sleep. You probably wouldn't survive the social networking of this era, where a polite hello could easily lead to a toxic argument about the purity of your bloodline or the quality of your mule. You trudge up to the loft, where the sleeping arrangements are a masterpiece of discomfort. The mattress is a canvas sack stuffed with straw that feels like it's filled with broken glass and angry beetles. The sound of the straw rustling is a dry, papery ASMR that would be relaxing if you didn't have to share the floor with 6 other snoring men and a very confused chicken. Don Quixote, of course, refuses to take off his armour. He leasts there in his rusted iron, looking like a discarded boiler, staring at the rafters and whispering to himself about the Lady Dulcinea. The clanking of his metal breastplate as he breathes, clink hiss, is the rhythmic heartbeat of a dream that refuses to die even in the filthiest of inns. As the candle at the end of the hall flickers and dies, leaving the venter in athic, toxic darkness that smells of old sweat and wood ash, you realize that while you might survive the night, your definition of luxury has been permanently altered. The stinking venter is a portal into a reality that is far more brutal than any book of chivalry ever admitted. You listen to the distant braying of a mule in the courtyard, a long, agonizing hee-haw. That sounds like the landscape itself is complaining about the rent. And you follow the night into a fitful sleep. You carry the weight of the Spanish road with you, a reminder that in a world of castles made of mud and giants made of wood, the only thing that is truly real is the sound of your own heart beating against the cold, indifferent stone of a La Mancha floor. You trudge out of the suffocating, soot-stained shadows of the venter just as Thesky begins to bruise with the first pale, watery indigo of a 4 a.m. dawn. The air here is no longer a toxic slurry of rancid oil and shared breath. It hastened brittle, sharp and smells of frozen dew clinging to dry lavender and the heavy, musky scent of 100 resting mules. You are standing in the courtyard of a world that is preparing to move, and the rhythm of the morning is a slow, mechanical waking. You probably won't survive this transition to the open road, not because of the cold, but because the sheer, bone-deep vibration of a mule train starting its day is enough to rattle your fillings loose. Before you've even had your first sip of water, you watch as the muleteers begin their morning symphony. These men are the long-haul truckers of the 17th century, except their rigs have long ears, a toxic temperament, and a tendency to bite anyone who doesn't respect their personal space. The sound in the courtyard is a rhythmic, industrial ASMR. The creak thud of heavy leather pack saddles being cinched tight around barrel-chested animals, and the metallic clink jingle of brass bells attached to the headstalls. You probably wouldn't survive a modern morning without a dashboard and a GPS. But for these men, the user interface is a collection of hemp ropes and a vocabulary of whistles that hasn't changed since the Romans left. As you trudge out onto the Royal Highway, which is really just a wide, dusty scar across the parched face of Spain, you realize you aren't just following a knight and a squire, you are joining a moving city. Behind you, a train of 30 mule scarries silk from Valencia and wool from the highlands, their hooves creating a constant hypnotic percussion on the stone-pitted dirt. Tack, tack, clack, tack, clack. It's a dry, hollow sound that vibrates through the soles of your boots and settles right in the base of your skull. You probably won't survive the commute in an age where the average speed is 3 miles per hour. But the rhythmic clatter of those hooves is the heartbeat of the Spanish economy, a slow motion pulse that keeps the empire from flatlining. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that mules were the absolute backbone of 17th century Spain. Because the terrain was so mountainous and the roads were so toxic to wheeled wagons, over 90% of the country's inland trade was moved in the backs of these stubborn hybrid animals. You see a mule train passing in the opposite direction, and the air is filled with a cloud of fine white dust that turns the sun into a pale, sickly coin. You feel the grit in your teeth, the taste of the road. It's a mix of pulverized limestone and ancient manure. You probably won't survive the 17th century version of smog. But for the travelers on this road, this dust is just the atmosphere of progress. A quirky or fringe tidbit that navigators of this era often obsessed over weighs the tuning of the mule bells. Muleteers didn't just throw any old bell on their lead animal. They chose specific tones so that even in a thick toxic fog or a moonless night, the rest of the train could follow the melody of the leader. As you walk, the sound is a rhythmic metallic chiming, ding low, dong high, a 17th century version of a lane assist system. You probably won't survive the realization that your playlist for the next 10 hours is just 2 notes played by a grumpy animal, but the repetition has a way of smoothing out your thoughts, sanding down the sharp edges of your anxiety until you're moving in a trance of leather and dust. You trudge alongside Sancho Panza, who is currently engaging in a deep tissue conversation with his donkey, Dapple. Sancho doesn't see a beast of burden. He sees a business partner. You feel the warmth radiating from the donkey's hide, a heavy animal heat that smells of sun-baked wool and honest labour. Sancho is reciting proverbs, hundreds of them, dropping them into the conversation like salt into a pot of stew. "A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush," he mutters, his voice a rhythmic, gravelly drone that matches the thud-thud of Dapple's feet. You probably wouldn't survive a long-distance hike with a man who speaks entirely in clichés, but Sancho's earthy wisdom is the only thing keeping the toxic idealism of Don Quixote from floating away into the clouds. Don Quixote, meanwhile, is a silhouette of jagged iron against the rising sun. He is currently maintaining his posture, which is a polite way of saying he looks like he's been stapled to his horse. You see the light catch the scars on his hand, the hand of glory we saw in part 2, and you realise that even on this dusty road he is still fighting a war. To him, the other travellers aren't just people, they are a diverse cast of souls in an epic poem. You pass a group of Benedictine friars in their heavy black robes that look like weighted blankets of holiness, and probably smell like they haven't seen soap since the Council of Trent. They are followed by a coche, a horse-drawn carriage that looks like a fancy wooden box on wheels, and is currently being bounced around by the potholes like a pair of dice in a cup. Historians still argue whether the diverse crowd Cervantes populated his roads was an accurate reflection of a shrinking, bankrupt Spain, or a literary toxic exaggeration meant to make the world feel more chaotic than it actually was. You feel that chaos as you walk. It's in the way a soldier returning from Flanders brushes past you, his armour covered in a layer of grey road grime, his eyes looking through you as if you were made of glass. It's in the way a group of itinerant seasonal workers, carrying their sickles like unhappy lances, sing a song about the harvest that sounds more like a funeral dirge. You probably won't survive the social complexity of this road, where a wrong look at a nobleman's mule could get you a toxic lecture, or a very real dagger between the ribs. The sun has reached its peak now, a heavy golden hammer that is currently trying to forge your rough collar into a ring of fire. The rhythm of the hooves, tuck-clack, has become a vibrating, white noise lullaby. You see the knight adjust his helmet of Mambrino, the brass basin creating a shimmering halo of heat that makes his head look like it's melting. You feel the weight of the day. It's a stiff kind of exhaustion that starts in your ankles and ends in your soul. As a muleteer lets out a long melodic whistle to signal a rest stop, the sound travels through the shimmering air like a silver wire. You trudge toward a small grove of holm oaks, their shadows looking like pools of cool ink on the scorched earth. The sound of the mules sighing as their loads are shifted. A long, leathery phew-phew is the sound of a world that is permanently tired but refuses to stop moving. You realise that while you might survive the distance, the mules and men of the Spanish road have a way of wearing you down, not with violence, but with the sheer rhythmic persistence of their existence. You follow the night into the shade, a witness to a world that is too busy surviving to care about being heroic, yet somehow manages to be both at the same time. The dust settles on your eyelashes, turning your vision into a grainy, 17th century filter, and you realise that on this road, the only thing more stubborn than a mule is a man with a dream he can't afford to lose. You trudge toward a corner of the Venta courtyard where the shadows are toxic, with the scent of unwashed reality and the flickering orange desperation of a dying fire. The rhythm of the road has finally ground to a halt, and the heavy silence of the night is now being punctuated by a new kind of percussion. The hollow wooden tick-scrape of a hand-carved spoon digging into the bottom of a charred ceramic bowl. We are stepping into the most gritty part of the 17th century Spanish experience, the dinner table, and fair warning, you probably won't survive this menu, not because of a poisoner, but because the secret ingredient in almost everything you're about to eat is either a high-definition layer of road grit or a type of bacon fat that has been aging since the previous dynasty. You find yourself sitting on a three-legged stool that has a vibrating instability, watching Sancho Panza perform a deep tissue investigation of a bowl of olla podrida. This is the national dish of Spain, but don't let the name fool you. It literally translates to rotten pot. You feel the heat of the fire on your shins, a weighted blanket of warmth that would be relaxing if your stomach weren't currently playing a solo on a very angry bass guitar. The air is thick with the scent of boiled chickpeas, garlic, and a piece of toxic salted pork that looks like it was cured in a chimney. You probably wouldn't survive Amadon farm-to-table experience if the farm was a parched field and the table was a splintering piece of oak that also doubles as a mule harness repair station. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that the 17th century Spanish diet was a brutal, calorie-starved struggle against nature. While the nobles in Madrid were eating toxic amounts of sugar and imported chocolate, the average person in La Mancha lived on a monotonous cycle of grain, legumes, and whatever scraps of animal protein they could scavenge. You pass us a piece of bread to Sancho. Bread that is so hard it sounds like a brick hitting the table. Clonk. It's the kind of stiff sourdough that requires a 10-minute soak in watered-down wine just to make it chewable. You probably won't survive the 17th century version of a gluten-free diet, mostly because gluten was the only thing standing between you and a permanent appointment with the soil. A quirky or fringe tidbit that Cervantes actually obsessed over was the specific dish known as duelos y quebrantos. In the very first paragraph of the book, he tells us that Alonso Quijano ate this every Saturday. The name literally means sorrows and breakings. Historians have spent centuries arguing over what this actually was, but the most toxic and likely theory is that it was an omelette made with the brains or spinal marrow of sheep that had died of natural causes during the week. Essentially, it was the roadkill cafe of the Golden Age. As you watch Sancho scramble a couple of eggs with bits of grey, mysterious meat, the sound is a rhythmic, wet slap hiss in the pan. You probably won't survive the realization that your luxury weekend brunch is actually a collection of veterinary failures. But for a hungry squire, it's a 5-star feast. You trudge through the sensory experience of the olla. The chickpeas are the stars of the show. Small, round, and so hard they feel like you re-eating 17th century buckshot. The sound of Sancho chewing them, crunch, pop, is a rhythmic dental ASMR that makes your own jaw ache in sympathy. Historians still argue whether the widespread madness and vision seeing of this era was actually caused by chronic malnutrition and toxic levels of ergot fungus in the rye bread. You feel that lightheadedness now as you look at Don Quixote. The knight isn't eating. He is currently nourishing himself on memories, which is a polite way of saying he's starving himself to look more like a saint. He watches Sancho eat with an expression of heavy disgust, as if the act of chewing were a personal insult to the concept of chivalry. You probably wouldn't survive a dinner where the vibe is 50% hunger and 50% clinical insanity, but you reach for the wineskin anyway. The leather is coolant heavy in your hand, smelling of the toxic pitch resin used to seal it. As you take a drink, the sound is a rhythmic, leathery glug-glug-glug that vibrates through your throat. The wine is sharp, vinegary, and has a vibrating aftertaste of old pine needles. It's the original natural wine in the sense that it tastes like nature accidentally died in your cup. As you scrape the last of the bacon fat residue from your bowl, the fire begins to collapse into a pile of white ash. The rhythmic tut-tuck of the embers cooling is the sound of the day officially ending. You realize that in this world, food isn't a hobby or a lifestyle choice. It's a toxic negotiation with survival. Sancho wipes his mouth on his sleeve, lets out a heavy sigh of contentment, and begins to talk about the insula again. You follow the knight and the squire back toward their toxic mattresses of straw, realizing that while you might survive the meal of scraps, your stomach has just learned the true meaning of quixotic. It's the sound of a world that is permanently hungry for something more, even if all it ever gets is another bowl of sorrows and breakings and a hard piece of bread to chew on in the dark. You trudge out of the firelit circle of the Venta courtyard and into a darkness so toxic and absolute it feels as though the universe has been swallowed by agent indigo velvet throat. The air here is no longer thick with the scent of rotten pot stew. It has turned stiff, brittle, and smells of frozen mountain pine and the dry ancient dust of the Sierra Morena. You are standing at the edge of a jagged ravine, and the rhythm of the night is a heavy, vibrating silence that feels like it's pressing against your eardrums with the weight of a physical object. You probably won't survive this transition to the high-altitude wilderness, not because of the cold, but because the sheer, unadulterated quiet of a 17th century mountain range is enough to make your modern, city-tuned brain start inventing its own noises just to fill the void. You watch Don Quixote find a luxury suite for the night, which is essentially a flat patch of dirt beneath a gnarled cork tree whose bark looks like toxic fossilized brain tissue. He doesn't take off his armor, of course. He believest that a true knight-errant must sleep in his harness, ready to leap into battle at the first sound of an enchanted trumpet. You probably wouldn't survive a night sleeping on a bed of rocks while wearing 50 pounds of cold, rusted iron. But Quixote is currently treating his breastplate like a weighted blanket of glory. The sound as he lies down is a rhythmic, metallic percussion, the clink-thud, clink-clank of iron meeting stone. It's a 1605 version of heavy metal ASMR, and it vibrates through the ground and right into the soles of your boots. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that the Sierra Morena was the most feared and toxic wilderness in Golden Age Spain. It was a massive, lawless borderland between the Central Plateau and Andalusia, a place where the roads were sonoro and the terrain so broken that even the king's soldiers didn't like to go there after dark. It was the primary haunt of bandoleros, the bandits who weren't the romanticized heroes of movies, but desperate, starving men who would kill you for your boots and a half-eaten piece of bacon. You feel that danger in the air. It's a heavy kind of tension. You pass a cluster of rocks and see a pair of eyes glowing in the dark. Is it a bandit, a wolf, or just your own toxic anxiety playing tricks on you in the moonlight? A quirky or fringe tidbit that mountain travelers of the era often whispered about was the Sierra Morena wind. Because of the unique geography of the ravines, the wind would often create a low-frequency, vibrating hum as it moved through the narrow gaps in the stone. Some locals believed this was the voice of the mountains themselves, or the ghostly sigh of the Moors who had hidden in these caves centuries ago. As you sit there, the sound is a rhythmic, mournful howling, whoosh, whoosh, that sounds like a 17th century white noise machine with a very dark personality. You probably won't survive their realization that your relaxing nature sounds are actually being produced by a geological fluke that sounds like a choir of the damned. But for the night, this wind is just the enchanted music of his quest. Historians still argue whether Don Quixote's retreat into the Sierra Morena was intended by Cervantes as a literal descent into the underworld, or a symbolic purgatory where the knight has to shed the last of his sanity to become a true legend. You feel that heavy symbolism as you watch Sancho Panza prepare for sleep. Sancho is a practical man. He doesn't care about geological flukes or symbolic descents. He just wants to stay warm. He huddles next to his donkey Dapple, using the animal's vibrating animal heat as a natural heater. The sound of the donkey's breathing, a slow rhythmic huff-shur, is the only thing that keeps the toxic cold from turning your blood into ice cubes. You probably wouldn't survive a modern camping trip without a 0-degree sleeping bag, but Sancho's weighted blanket is made of donkey fur and stubbornness. You move closer to the fire, or what's left of it. It's just a vibrating pile of red embers now, smelling of toxic charcoal and dry cedar. Don Quixote is wide awake, staring at the stars. To him, the Milky Way isn't a collection of gas and dust. It's the path to St. James, a celestial highway for heroes. He begins to recite a complaint to the moon, his voice a low rhythmic drone that matches the tuck-tuck of the cooling embers. "Oh, Lady Dulcinea," he mutters, and you realize that he is currently maintaining his focus by refusing to let therality of the cold or the rocks penetrate his brain fire. He is a man who has successfully turned a toxic situation into a romantic epic. You probably wouldn't survive a meditation session where the temperature is dropping toward freezing and the instructor is a man who thinks his beard is a holy relic, but you find yourself drifting off anyway. The sound of the wind, the rhythmic breathing of the donkey, and the metallic clink of the knight's armor all blend into a stiff, frozen lullaby. You realize that in the Sierra Morena, the night isn't just a time for sleep. It's a heavy test of endurance. You follow the night into the realm of dreams, a witness to a world where the only thing colder than the mountain air is the toxic indifference of the universe. The stars blink down at you like the vibrating rivets in the sky, and you realize that on this mountain the only thing more vast than the darkness is the quixotic heart of a man who refuses to be small. You trudge out of the stiff, frozen silence of the mountain peaks just as the sun begins to bleed a weak, watery orange over the jagged granite teeth of the Sierra Morena. The air here has lost its toxic midnight bite, replaced by a heavy, humid haze that smells of damp wool, scorched cedar, and the sharp, medicinal tang of lavender-infused alcohol. You are standing on the edge of Theroil Highway, and the rhythm of the morning is a slow, rhythmic clinking, a sound that feels like a weighted blanket of metallic percussion. You probably won't survive this transition to 17th century hygiene, not because of a plague, but because the sight of a travelling barber surgeon's toolkit is enough to make your modern, stainless steel and antibiotic cream brain want to crawl back into that cave and hide under a pile of goat skins. You watch as a figure approaches on a weary mule, the animal's ears flopping in a rhythmic, leathery thud-thud that matches the swaying of the large leather bags slung across its flanks. This is the barber surgeon, the itinerant miracle worker of the Spanish Road. He doesn't have a degree from a university, but he has a vibrating confidence and a set of razors that could double as butter knives. The sound in the air is a rhythmic, industrial ASMR. The clink-jingle of brass basins hitting iron probes inside his bags. You probably wouldn't survive a modern gentleman's shave if the barber started by checking your pulse for evil spirits and ended by offering to pull a molar with a pair of rusty blacksmith's pliers. But in 1605, this man is the closest thing to a healthcare provider for miles. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that in the Golden Age of Spain, the roles of barber and surgeon were inextricably linked. These men were the cirujanos barberos, a hybrid profession that meant you could get your beard trimmed and your leg amputated in the same chair, often by the same guy using the same lukewarm water. You see him set up his clinic beneath a gnarled oak tree. He takes out his toxic kit, a collection of iron lancets for bloodletting, bone saws that look like they've been used to prune hedges, and arrow of razors that are stiff with the residue of 100 previous customers. You probably won't survive the 17th century version of infection control, which consists primarily of wiping a blade on a dirty apron and hoping for the best. But Miguel de Cervantes knew this world intimately. Remember, his own father was one of these struggling travelling surgeons. A quirky or fringe tidbit that social historians often discuss is the origin of the barber pole. While we see it as a colourful spinning sign today, in Quixote's time, it had a much more heavy and literal meaning. Barbers would hang the white linen bandages they used during bloodletting on a pole outside their shop to dry in the wind. As the blood-soaked fabric twisted in the breeze, it created that red and white spiral. You probably won't survive the realization that your favorite retro aesthetic is actually a 17th century laundry list of medical trauma. But for the travelers on this road, that pole was a vibrating beacon of relief. You watch the barber prepare his lather in a brass basin, the helmet of Mambrino we saw earlier, and the sound is a rhythmic, soapy slosh. It's a 1605 version of a soothing spa sound, except the spa is a dusty road and the lather is made from pig fat and wood ash. You trudge over to the shaving station alongside Sancho Panza, who is currently eyeing the barber's razors with a heavy amount of suspicion. Sancho doesn't want to shave. He wants to know if the barber has any of that toxic pitch wine we drank at the Venta. Don Quixote, however, is standing as stiff as a frozen board. He believes that the barber is an enchanter in disguise, possibly sent by Freston to steal back the golden helmet. You see the knight's beard, a tangled, vibrating thicket of grey hair and road dust, and you realise that even a magical knight needs a trim occasionally. The barber begins toss-drop his razor on a long strip of oiled leather. The sound is a rhythmic, leathery whiff-snap, that sounds like a tiny whip being cracked in the silence of the morning. You probably wouldn't survive a shave where the blade is sharpened on a piece of cowhide that's been sitting in mule sweet for 3 weeks. But the repetition has a way of smoothing out your own toxic thoughts, sanding down the edges of your mountain-induced anxiety. Historians still argue whether Cervantes intended the barber character as a sympathetic nod to his own father's difficult life, or a biting parody of the lower middle-class obsession with professional status. You feel that heavy tension as the barber begins to apply the lather to Quixote's face. The soap is stiff, cold, and smells of toxic lye and cheap perfume. The sound of the brush hitting the brass basin, tick-clink, sack-clink, is a metallic percussion that vibrates right through the knight's skull. You probably won't survive the social etiquette of this era, where a barber might accidentally nick your jugular if he suspects you're a converso. Remember the blood purity secrets from part 1. But the barber is currently too busy trying to figure out why his customer is wearing a piece of his own equipment on his head. You move closer to the surgical theatre, and you see the barber take out his bloodletting bowl. This is where things get heavy. He explains that Quixote looks feverish and suggests releasing a few ounces of melancholy. In the 17th century, bloodletting was the weighted blanket of medicine. People believed that almost every illness, from a common cold to literal madness, could be cured by draining the toxic excess blood. You watch as the barber prepares his lancet, the sound of him testing the edge on his thumb. A soft leatherisnick is the sound of a world that believes healing must always involve a little bit of hurt. You probably wouldn't survive a wellness check that involves a sharp piece of iron and a brass bowl, but for the people of La Mancha, this is just the vibrating rhythm of health. The shave begins in earnest now. The sound of the razor rasping against Quixote's stiff stubble, shurich, shurich, is a dry, textured ASMR that sounds like someone walking on dried corn husks. You see the knight's eyes roll back in his head as he enters a trance of chivalry. Ignoring the toxic sting of the lye soap, he is currently maintaining his dignity, while a man in a grease-stained vest holds a knife to his throat. It's the ultimate quixotic moment. A man who fears nothing in a battle being perfectly submissive to a village barber under an oak tree. You probably wouldn't survive the irony of a man who charges windmills but flinches at a cold sponge, but the barber's shave is a ritual that levels the playing field between knights and peasants. As the barber finishes, he splashes a handful of toxic vinegar and rosewater onto Quixote's face to close the pores. The sound of the knight's sharp, rhythmic inhaling, hiss, phew, is the sound of the day truly beginning. You realize that in this world, even a shave is a heavy negotiation with reality. The barber packs his toxic kit back into the leather bags, the belson the mule's headstall, giving a final metallic clink jingle of farewell. You follow the knight and the squire back toward the road, realizing that while you might survive the barber's razor, your definition of self-care has been permanently scarred by the 17th century. The sun is a vibrating gold coin in the sky now, reflecting off Quixote's freshly scrubbed brass basin and turning the road ahead into a heavy ribbon of white fire. You listen to the distant braying of the barber's mule, a long, agonizing sound that sounds like the bureaucracy of Spain itself is sighing, and you follow the knight into the shimmering heat. You carry the weight of the Spanish road with you, a reminder that in a world of enchanted helmets made of brass and bloodletting made of hope, the only thing that is truly stiff is the resolve of a man who refuses to believe his shave was anything less than a holy anointing. The rhythmic clack-clink of the hooves resumes, a mechanical lullaby for a world that is still trying to bleed the madness out of its heroes. You realize that on this road, the only thing more dangerous than a giant is a man with a sharp razor and a theory about your humors. You settle into the vibrating rhythm of the march, the scent of rosewater and mule dung trailing behind you like a toxic ghost, and you realize that your journey through the Scars of Lepanto and the Spanish road has only just reached its midpoint. The windmills are waiting, the giants are calling, and the heavy silence of history is currently being rewritten, one stiff stroke of the razor at a time. You trudge away from the lingering, floral sweet scent of the barber's rosewater and the metallic, coppery tang of the bloodletting bowl, and for a moment Therode feels like a toxic, endless loop of white lime and heat shimmer. We are stepping into the most iconic landscape in all of literature, the Campo de Criptana, where the horizon doesn't just stretch, it vibrates with allo frequency, heavy hum that sounds like the earth itself is having an anxiety attack. It is late afternoon in La Mancha, and the sun is no longer a hammer. It's a glowing orange eye that seems to be squinting at you through the toxic haze of the plateau. You probably won't survive this level of atmospheric intensity. Not because of a dragon, but because the sheer unblinking flatness of this world is enough to make your modern mountain and skyscraper brain fold in on itself like a cardboard visor in a rainstorm. You are walking beside Rocinante, whose hooves are making a slow rhythmic clack-puff in the deep powdery dust. The air here is stiff, bone-dry, and smells of parched wheat, toasted flint, and the faint, toxic musk of a distant goat herd. As you crest a low stony ridge, you see them. At first, they look like a collection of white sails floating on a sea of dirt. There are 30 or 40 of them, rising out of the earth like the heavy bones of a long-dead civilization. To you, they are windmills, marvels of 16th century industrial design. To Don Quixote, who is currently tightening his grip on a lance that is essentially a very ambitious curtain pole, they are monstrous giants with arms nearly 2 leagues long. You probably wouldn't survive a modern job interview if your strategic vision involved attacking renewable energy sources. But Quixote is currently nourishing himself on adrenaline, and he's never felt more alive. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that windmills were actually a high-tech foreign intrusion in La Mancha during Cervantes' life. They had been recently imported from the Low Countries, modern-day Netherlands, because the region was so toxic for water mills. The rivers were constantly drying up, leaving the grain unground. To an old-fashioned hidalgo who hated change, these whirring, creaking machines weren't just buildings. They were the heavy symbols of a world that was moving too fast. You feel the wind beginning to pick up, a vibrating whistle that moves through the gaps in the stone towers. The sound of the wooden machinery inside. The creak grind of the massive millstones is a rhythmic industrial ASMR that would be relaxing if it didn't sound so much like a giant grinding his teeth in the dark. A quirky or fringe tidbit that mill historians often discuss is the toxic nature of the dust inside these towers. The friction of the stones grinding the grain created a fine, explosive flour cloud that could ignite with a single spark. Some scholars suggest that the giants were feared not just because they were tall, but because they occasionally exploded like 17th century grenades. You probably won't survive the irony of a knight trying to be a hero and getting taken out by a loaf of bread in its rawest form. As Quixote spurs Rocinante forward, the sound of the canvas sails catching the wind, a rhythmic, snapping whip whoosh. Whip whoosh is the sound of a world that is fundamentally indifferent to knightly vows. Historians still argue whether the windmills were intended as a metaphor for the Spanish Inquisition, looming white towers that could crush anyone who got too close, or if they were just a heavy bit of slapstick to show that the knight's madness was reaching its toxic peak. You feel that weight as you watch Sancho Panza frantically trying to explain that those arms are just wooden sails. Sancho is a man of the earth. He knows that giants don't have 4 arms and liven hillsides eating wheat, but Quixote is already in a vibrating trance of glory. He tells Sancho to go hide behind a rock if he's afraid, because he is about to engage in fierce and unequal combat. You probably wouldn't survive a boss who handles reality checks by telling you to go stand behind a bush. But Sancho just sighs a heavy sigh and watches the disaster unfold in high definition. You move closer to the base of the first windmill, and you see the way the whitewashed stone is stiff with age. The wind is howling now, a toxic scream that makes your rough collar flap against your neck like a trapped bird. Quixote lowers his lance. He recites a prayer to Dulcinea. Remember the garlic rose from part 3, and he charges. The sound of Rocinante's hooves hitting the rocky ground is a frantic, vibrating percussion. Tick-tick-clack. You watch the impact in slow motion. The lance hits the moving sail, the sail hits back with the force of a falling cathedral, and the peaceful bedtime vibe is officially shattered by the sound of splintering timber and bending iron. Quixote is lifted clean out of his saddle. He flies through the air like a toxic piece of scrap metal and hits the ground with a dull, heavy thwap that vibrates through your own shins. His brass basin helmet, the helmet of Mambrino, comes flying off and rolls across the dirt with a rhythmic metallic ping-ting, ping-ting. You probably wouldn't survive being hit by a 16th century industrial turbine, but Quixote is held together by the heavy glue of his Andalusians. He lies there in the dust, his armour covered in white flour powder, looking like a ghost that just lost a fight with a baker. As the wind continues to spin the sails, whoosh, whoosh, you realise that for the night, the only thing more real than a giant is the enchanter who turned that giant into a windmill just to ruin his afternoon. You follow Sancho as he hauls his master back to his feet, a witness to a world where the heavy silence of the plateau is the only thing that truly wins every battle. You trudge across the parched lunar landscape of the Campo de Criptana, but the ground beneath your feet is no longer just dirt and rock. It has been coated in a fine, toxic layer of white flour dust that has drifted out from the base of the massive towers, like a localized blizzard in the middle of a Spanish summer. The air here is stiff, heavy with the smell of ground wheat and the sharp, hot oil scent of wooden gears working against each other under immense pressure. You are standing in the immediate aftermath of a collision between 17th century physics and a 16th century fantasy, and the rhythm of the moment is a slow, vibrating groan of moving timber. Cree-ack thud, cree-ack thud. It's a rhythmic, mechanical ASMR. The sound of the giants continuing to chew through the harvest, entirely unaware that a middle-aged man in a cardboard helmet just tried to commit regicide against them. You probably won't survive this transition into the mechanical heart of La Mancha. Not because the windmill will eat you, but because the sheer heavy industrial noise inside these towers is enough to rattle your skull like a bean in a dried gourd. You watch the sails overhead, massive rectangular frames of holm oak, covered in coarse, stiff canvas. They are currently spinning at a vibrating speed, catching the parched winds that whip across the plateau. To you, they are efficient machines designed to separate husk from grain. To Don Quixote, who is currently lying in a weighted blanket of dust, at the base of the tower, they were the flailing arms of a Briarean monster. You probably wouldn't survive a modern commute if your traffic jam involved being thrown 20 feet by a piece of renewable energy. But Quixote is currently maintaining his narrative, which is his only real defense against a broken rib. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that the construction of these windmills was a feat of stiff engineering. The entire roof of the tower, called the cap, was designed to be rotated by a long wooden pole so the sails could always face the wind. You feel the vibrating power of the wind as it hits the canvas. Fwhip snap, fwhip whoosh. It's a rhythmic, snapping sound that mimics the heartbeat of an empire that is trying to automate its way out of poverty. You trudge over to where Quixote's lance, or what's left of it, is protruding from a wooden slat in the sail. It has been splintered into 1,000 toxic toothpicks. You probably wouldn't survive a project where your primary tool is a curtain pole, and your primary target is a 4-story building. But for the night, this splintered wood is enchanted evidence of a battle that actually happened. A quirky or fringe tidbit that millers of the era used to whisper about was the medicinal, or toxic, properties of the mill grease. The massive wooden axles were lubricated with a mix of pig fat and pulverized lead to keep them from catching fire during the high-speed grinding of the summer months. As you stand near the tower, you can smell that heavy, metallic musk. Some locals believed that if you rubbed this black, lead-heavy sludge on your joints, it would cure the stiff pains of old age. You probably won't survive the 17th century version of deep heat if it contains enough lead to sink a Venetian galley. But for the people of Criptana, the giant sweat was a powerful, vibrating balm. You watch a drop of this black grease fall from the axle and hit the white flour dust, a toxic ink blot on a landscape of bread. Historians still argue whether the windmill scene was a direct satirical attack on the rapid technological changes of the early 1600s. Was Cervantes trying to say that the old Spain of chivalry was literally being ground into dust by the new Spain of industry and profit? You feel that heavy cultural friction as you watch Quixote struggle to sit up. He is stiff with pain, his armor clanking with every movement. Clink snap, clink clank. It's a metallic percussion of failure. He doesn't look at the windmill and see a machine. He looks at it and sees a shifter of shape. He is currently nourishing himself on a conspiracy theory, explaining to Sancho that the wizard Freston, the Samio who stole his library, transformed the giants into mills at the very last second just to deny him the trophy of a giant's head. You probably wouldn't survive a performance review where your excuse for missing a deadline was, "Our wizard did it." But in the vibrating logic of the knight's brain, this is a perfectly reasonable explanation for a concussion. You trudge closer to the knight, and you see the way the toxic, white flower has settled into the creases of his gaunt face, making him look like a vibrating marble statue. The peaceful bedtime vibe is once again interrupted by the sound of Sancho Panza's voice, a rhythmic, heavy drone of common sense. Sancho currently maintaining his boundary by refusing to believe in giants while simultaneously checking his master for broken bones. "Didn't I tell you?" Sancho mutters, his voice sounding like a weighted blanket of reality, "that they were only windmills." You probably wouldn't survive a road trip with a partner who is 100% committed to being right. But Sancho's pragmatism is the only thing keeping Quixote's toxic ego from floating away into the stratosphere. The wind is beginning to die down now, the howling toxic scream of the plater fading into a low stiff whistle. You see the mill sails slowing their vibrating dance. Whoosh, pause, whoosh. It's a slow-motion lullaby for a broken hero. You feel the weight of the moment. It's a heavy kind of irony. Quixote isn't just charging a building, he's charging at shadows. He is fighting a war against a world that has replaced the enchanted forest with a grain processing facility. He is the original toxic traditionalist, a man who would rather be beaten by a giant than ignored by a machine. You probably wouldn't survive a night in this dust-choked landscape without a mask and some eye drops. But for the knight, the flower in his eyes is just the vibrating stardust of a quest. As the sun begins to sink, casting long, spindly shadows of the windmills across the plateau, shadows that look like heavy, black fingers reaching for your soul, you follow the knight and the squire as they move away from the Campo de Criptana. The rhythmic clack-puff of the hooves resumes, a mechanical heartbeat for a world that is still trying to decide if it wants to be heroic or just efficient. You realize that while you might survive the collision, the charging at shadows has ensured that your definition of reality is now as stiff and lopsided as Quixote's cardboard visor. You settle into the vibrating rhythm of the retreat, the scent of ground wheat and pig grease trailing behind you like a toxic ghost. And you realize that on this plateau, the only thing more persistent than the wind is the quixotic refusal to believe that a machine is just a machine. The heavy silence of history is currently being rewritten, one stiff charge at a time, and the giants are still there, whirring in the dark, waiting for the next dreamer to think he can stop the world from turning. You trudge away from the whirring, white-winged wreckage of the Campo de Criptana, and for a moment the road feels like a toxic, high-definition loop parched yellow and indifferent blue. The air here has lost the industrial, flowery tang of the windmills, replaced by a heavy, humid musk that smells of unwashed donkey fur, sun-baked leather, and the sharp, aggressive pungency of an old piece of Manchego cheese that's been sitting in a stiff burlap sack for 3 days too long. You are walking beside Dapple, the donkey whose back is currently supporting the most vibrating source of common sense in all of Western literature, Sancho Panza. You probably won't survive this level of sensory grounding, not because of a giant, but because the sheer rhythmic repetition of Sancho's proverbs is enough to turn your modern, high-speed internet brain into a heavy bowl of lukewarm gazpacho. You find yourself matching your pace to the donkey's hooves, thud-scuff, a slow, earthy percussion that vibrates through the dry Spanish soil and right into your shins. Sancho is currently maintaining his posture, which is a polite way of saying he's slumped over his mount like a sack of damp grain, looking for any sign of a toxic tavern or a shady tree. He doesn't see a theatre of glory, he sees a theatre of hunger. To him, the horizon isn't a premise of an empire, it's a list of potential snack locations. You probably wouldn't survive a job interview where the benefits package was a promise open island and the daily duties involved being trampled by livestock. But Sancho is currently nourishing himself on the long game, and he's decided that as long as there's wine in the wineskin, The knight's madness is a manageable toxic workplace environment. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that the 17th century Spanish peasantry was almost entirely illiterate, relying on a heavy oral tradition of refrains or proverbs to navigate the world. To a man like Sancho, a proverb isn't just a cliché. It's a stiff, reliable piece of survival technology. You hear him muttering them under his breath, a rhythmic, gravelly ASMR of folk wisdom. A belly full makes a heart merry, he says, his voice a vibrating drone that matches the swaying of his own stomach. You probably wouldn't survive a 10-hour hike. With a man who speaks exclusively in live, laugh, love signs from 1605. But for the knight, Sancho's heavy stream of proverbs is the only anchor keeping his toxic imagination from drifting off into the void. A quirky or fringe tidbit that Cervantes scholars love to obsess over is the mystery of the missing donkey. In the original 1605 printing of Part 1, Sancho's donkey, Dapple, magically disappears in one chapter and reappears in the next without explanation. Likely because Cervantes was writing in a toxic rush and simply forgot he'd had a thief steal the animal. When fans pointed it out, Cervantes didn't apologize. He just made it part of the joke in Part 2, having Sancho explain it as a wizard's prank. You probably won't survive their realization that the greatest novel ever written was edited with the same vibrating level of care as a late-night text message. But for the duo on Therode, a missing donkey is just another heavy day in a world ruled by enchanters. Historians still argue whether Sancho is actually a fool who believes in Theasland promise, or a genius of greed who is simply using Quixote as a meal ticket. You feel that heavy ambiguity as you watch him reach into his stiff saddlebags and pull out a handful of dried chickpeas. He offers you one, and the sound of him cracking it between his teeth, crick, pop, is a rhythmic, dental percussion that sounds like a tiny bone breaking in the silence of the plateau. He doesn't look at Quixote and see a hero. He sees a vibrating disaster waiting to happen. But there is a toxic kind of loyalty forming here. Sancho, maintaining the balance, acting as the weighted blanket of reality that keeps the knight from flying too high. He is the person who tells the hero that his castle smells like mule dung and his giants are made of wood. You move closer to the donkey, and you see the way the stiff, grey fur is coated in a toxic layer of road dust. The peaceful bedtime vibe is once again grounded out of Sancho's wineskin, a rhythmic, leathery slosh glug that sounds like the heartbeat of a very happy pig. Sancho takes a drink, his throat moving in a vibrating cadence of satisfaction. God bless the man who invented sleep, he mutters. And you realize that while the knight wants to live forever in a book, the squire just wants to live through the afternoon. It's the ultimate toxic relationship. Omen wants to change the world, and the other just wants to make sure the world doesn't change his lunch schedule. The sun is currently maintaining its intensity, turning the parched grass of La Mancha into a heavy sea of white fire. You see the knight adjust his brass basin helmet, the helmet of Mambrino, which is reflecting the sun into Sancho's eyes like a toxic laser beam. Sancho doesn't complain. He just adjusts his wide-brimmed straw hat, a stiff circle of protection that makes him look like a vibrating mushroom. You probably wouldn't survive the social hierarchy of this duo, where one gets to be the enchanted visionary and the other has to be the human first aid kit. But Sancho's heavy pragmatism is what makes the story possible. Without the squire, the knight would have died off thirst at the first windmill. Without the knight, the squire would have spent his whole life staring at the same toxic patch of dirt in his village. As you trudge toward a small, stiff cluster of olive trees, their shadows looking like pools of cool, dark ink on the scorched earth, you follow the knight and the squire into a momentary rest. The sound of the donkey exhaling a long, leathery phew is the sound of the Sancho balance in action. You realize that while you might survive the madness, the earthy wisdom of the squire is the only thing that makes the heavy silence of the plateau tolerable. You settle into the vibrating rhythm of the camp, the scent of garlic and donkey sweet trailing behind you like a toxic ghost, and you realize that on this road the only thing more stiff than the knight's armor is the common sense of a man who knows that you can't eat a legend, but you can certainly drink a wineskin full of reality. The heavy silence of history is currently being anchored by a short man on a donkey, and the giants are still there, whirring in the distance, while Sancho Panza quietly checks his bag for another piece of cheese. You trudge away from the parched, shimmering surface of the Spanish plateau and find yourself standing at the jagged, toxic mouth of a subterranean void. The air here has lost the scent of sun-baked wheat and donkey fur, replaced by a heavy, bone-chilling dampness that smells of wet limestone, ancient mould, and the sharp, mineral tang of stagnant water. You are standing at the edge of the Cave of Montesinos, a deep, vertical scar in the earth that looks like a stiff wound that never quite healed. The rhythm of the afternoon has been replaced by a slow, vibrating silence that feels like a weighted blanket of shadows pressing against your chest. You probably won't survive this transition into the underworld. Not because of a demon, but because the sheer, unventilated claustrophobia of a 17th century cave is enough to make your modern open-concept brain want to vibrate right out of your skull. You watch Don Quixote prepare for his deep-tissue exploration of the earth. He isn't wearing his armor this time. Even he realizes that trying to rappel down a vertical shaft while wearing 50 pounds of rusted iron is a toxic recipe for a very fast trip to the bottom. He is in his shirt sleeves, tied to a long, stiff hemp rope that Sancho Panza is currently cinching around his waist, with the nervous intensity of a man who knows he's about to hold his boss's life in his hands. The sound in the clearing is a rhythmic, fibrous ASMR. Thesha creak, shrill creak of the rope fibers, rubbing against the gnarled trunk of a wild fig tree. You probably wouldn't survive a modern rock climbing session where the safety equipment was manufactured by a local weaver out of dried weeds and hope, but Quixote is currently nourishing himself on legend, and he's ready to descend into the very heart of chivalry. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that the Cueva de Montesinos is a real geological feature in the province of Albacete, Spain. In the 1600s, it was a legendary spot, rumoured to be an ancient hiding place for the Moors or a portalto, an enchanted subterranean kingdom. You feel the vibrating coolness rising from the dark as Quixote steps over the edge. The descent is a slow, heavy percussion. The tack scrape of his boots against the damp rock and the rhythmic whip of 100 bats being disturbed by his intrusion. To you, those are Tadarida brasiliensis, common free-tailed bats. To Don Quixote, they are enchanted birds of the underworld sent to guard the secrets of the cave. You probably won't survive the 17th century version of a nature hike if it involves being hit in the face by a leathery toxic wing in total darkness. But for the night, every bat flick is a vibrating greeting from a sorcerer, a quirky or fringed tidbit that 17th century naturalists used to debate was the hollow earth theory. Many people believed that caves weren't just holes but the breathing holes of a living planet. They thought the air inside was toxic or stiff because it was the Earth's own exhaled breath. As you watch the rope go slack, the sound is a rhythmic hollow silence, a 1605 version of a sensory deprivation tank. You probably won't survive the realization that your hero has just disappeared into a hole that smells like a damp basement and fossilized guano. But for Sancho, who is sitting at the top holding the rope, this is the first heavy peace and quiet he's had in 300 miles. Historians still argue whether the Cave of Montesinos episode was Cervantes' way of parodying Dante's Inferno, or if it was the literal turning point where the novel stops being a comedy and starts becoming a heavy psychological study of a man's internal landscape. You feel that vibrating shift as we wait for Quixote to return. Half an hour passes, then an hour. Sancho begins to haul the rope back up, and the sound is a rhythmic, grunting labour. Creaks a snap, heave-ho. When Quixote finally emerges, he is stiff and pale, looking like a man who has been weighted down by a vision. He tells a story that makes the windmills look like a boring documentary. He claims he spent 3 days in a crystal palace, where he saw the legendary hero Durandarte lying on a marble slab, his heart being cut out with a toxic little dagger to be delivered to his lady, Belerma. You probably wouldn't survive a meditation retreat, where your primary hallucination involves 15th century cardiac surgery, but Quixote is currently maintaining his reality with a stiff and terrifying conviction. He describes Dulcinea, remember our garlic rose, skipping through the crystal halls asking him for a loan of 6 reals. It's the ultimate toxic encounter. Even in his greatest fantasy, his lady love is broke and needs cash. You watch Sancho's face as he listens to this. Sancho knows they've only been there for an hour. He knows his master was likely asleep at the end of the rope, dreaming a heavy dream fueled by low oxygen and a vibrating brain fire. But Quixote is stiff in his belief. He has seen the truth of the underworld, and the toxic reality of the sunlit world above is now the thing that feels fake to him. As you trudge away from the cave mouth at twilight, the scent of damp moss is replaced by the smell of the evening vibrating with cricket songs. Quixote looks older, his eyes fixed on some internal horizon that you can't see. The weighted blanket of the cave's silence is still wrapped around his shoulders. You realize that while you might survive the descent, the cave of Montesinos has ensured that the night's madness is no longer just a toxic reaction to books. It's an entire ecosystem he carries inside him. You follow the duo as they move back toward the road, the rhythmic thud-thud of the donkey and the skeletal horse creating a stiff and melancholic lullaby. The heavy silence of Histrius, currently being populated by crystal palaces and bleeding hearts. And the only thing more vast than the cave is the quixotic capacity to dream yourself into a hero while dangling from a weed rope in a hole in the ground. You trudge into a twilight that feels like it's been bruised purple and orange by the very hand of the horizon. The parched, white flour dust of the windmills has settled into the creases of your skin. But now it's mixed with a new toxic layer, the sticky coppery scent of dried blood and the sharp eye-watering sting of a 17th century liniment made of rosemary, oil and salt. You are standing in a dry ditch at the side of a road that has officially run out of mercy. The rhythm of the evening is no longer the vibrating whistle of the wind. It is the slow, agonizing, heavy groaning of 2 men whose bones have been individually introduced to the concept of kinetic energy. You probably won't survive this transition to the gritty physical reality of the night's journey. Not because of an enchantment, but because the sheer bone-deep ache over quixotic beating is enough to make your modern, ergonomically supported spine want to resign in protest. You watch Don Quixote now. He's lying flat on his back, his armour looking like a stiff and dented sardine can that's been run over by a mule train. He isn't looking at the stars, he's looking at the inside of his own eyelids, where the giants are still doing victory laps. The sound in the ditch is a rhythmic, mournful ASMR. The huff of a man trying to find a position that doesn't feel like he's lying on a bed of hot needles. You probably wouldn't survive a team-building exercise where the feedback was delivered by 20 Yangisan carriers using polished oak poles. But for Quixote, this is just the heavy and necessary price of being a legend. He mutters about the law of arms, his voice a vibrating rasp that sounds like a dry wind moving through a rusted pipe. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that in the golden age of Spain, the roads were a theatre of unregulated violence. There was no national police force, no emergency room, and no toxic litigation for personal injury. If you got into a fight with 20 mule drivers because your skeletal horse tried to flirt with their mares, the only justice you received was exactly what was currently vibrating through Quixote's ribs. You feel the heavy weight of that lawlessness as you watch Sancho Panza crawl toward his master. Sancho is stiff with bruises, his round face looking like a toxic plum that's been dropped down a flight of stairs. He isn't thinking about islands anymore. He's thinking about how much he hates the concept of CrossFit 1605. A quirky or fringe tidbit that 17th century medical historians often point out is the balsam of Fierabras. In the knight's brain fire, this was a magical potion that could heal any wound instantly, even if a knight had been sliced in half. In reality, the recipe Quixote gives Sancho is a toxic cockle of oil, wine, salt, and rosemary. As you watch Quixote prepare this brew over a small, vibrating fire, the sound is a rhythmic, wet slosh bubble in a cracked ceramic jar. You probably won't survive the 17th century version over wellness shot, especially when Quixote drinks it and immediately engages in a heavy and violent session of projectile vomiting. But in the stiff logic of his madness, the fact that he almost dies after drinking it is evidence that it's working. It's the ultimate no pain, no gain philosophy taken to a toxic extreme. Historians still argue whether the extreme physical violence in the novel was meant by Cervantes as a direct parody of the bloodless injuries in chivalry books, where knights get hit by giants and just keep walking, or if it was a heavy reflection of Cervantes' own physical trauma from Lepanto. You feel that trauma in the air. It's a stiff and coppery atmosphere. You watch as Quixote tries to stand up, the sound of his armour clanking, clink groan, clink snap, sounding like a 1605 version of a junkyard symphony. He doesn't see a toxic defeat. He sees a trial of faith. He explains to Sancho that Therox hit him because an enchanter turned the air into lead. You probably wouldn't survive a reality check from a man who can turn a broken tooth into a badge of knightly honour. But Sancho just nods a heavy nod and asks if the balsam is ready for his own bruises. You trudge closer to the knight, and you see the way the vibrating heat of the fire reflects off his brass basin, which is now dented in 3 different places. The peaceful bedtime vibe is once again interrupted by the sound of the Santa Hermandad in the distance. The Holy Brotherhood, the 17th century equivalent of a rural highway patrol. They are coming to investigate the toxic chaos the duo has left behind. The sound of their horses' hooves is a rhythmic, heavy, thudding, thump, thump, thump. It's the sound of the law finally catching up with the dream. You probably wouldn't survive a traffic stop in 1605, where the officer has the power to send you to the galleys. Remember Miguel's chains from part 2. But Quixote is currently maintaining his focus by pretending the officers are enchanted archers sent from the underworld. The night is beginning to turn stiff and cold now, the heavy silence of the plateau returning as the Brotherhood passes by in the dark. You see the knight and the squire huddled together in the ditch, looking like a toxic pile of discarded laundry. You feel the weight of the moment. It's a stiff kind of endurance. Quixote isn't just suffering from bruises. He's suffering from a world that answers nobility with gravity. He is the original toxic optimist, a man who would rather be broken in reality than whole in a boring life. You probably wouldn't survive a night in this ditch without a sleeping bag and some ibuprofen. But for the knight, the vibrating pain in his shoulder is just the rhythmic heartbeat of a hero. As the moon rises, a cold, heavy silver basin in the sky that looks like the Hemet of Mambrino before the beatings began. You follow the knight and the squire as they limp away from the ditch. The rhythmic clack-drag of their feet resumes a stiff and melancholic lullaby for a world that is still trying to decide if it wants to laugh at its dreamers or weep for them. You realize that while you might survive the bruises, the beatings and bruises have ensured that your definition of glory is now as heavy and dented as Quixote's iron breastplate. You settle into the vibrating rhythm of the retreat, the scent of rosemary and vomit trailing behind you like a toxic ghost, and you realize that on this road, the only thing more stiff than the knight's body is the quixotic heart that refuses to stop beating for a world that doesn't exist. The heavy silence of history is currently being rewritten, one stiff, groan at a time, and the giants are still out there, waiting for the next man to think he can change the world with a toxic liniment and a heart full of broken iron. You trudge out of the bruised twilight of the roadside ditch, but the road ahead is no longer just made of parched dirt and lime. It is now constructed from a toxic, high-definition slurry of wet ink and the vanilla-sweet scent of freshly printed paper. We are stepping back into the village of La Mancha, but the year is now 1614, and the air is vibrating with a new kind of heavy energy. You are standing in the village square, and for the first time in this entire journey, the people aren't looking at the windmills or the sheep. They are looking at you. Or rather, they are looking at the book tucked under your arm. You probably won't survive this transition into the world of metafiction, not because of an enchantment, but because the sheer, brain-drying complexity of being a character who knows he's a character is enough to make your modern, four-screen multitasking brain want to crawl back into a dark library and hide. You watch Don Quixote now. He's standing in his yard and he's holding a letter. The paper is stiff, crisp, and smells of toxic linseed oil and iron galling. This is the moment the vibrating reality of the first part of our story meets the 17th century equivalent of a social media comment section. You see the knight's gaunt face, remember the sorrowful countenance, twist into an expression of heavy confusion. He has just learned that his first sally, the windmills, the wineskins and the balsam of Fierabras, have all been published in a book. You probably wouldn't survive a reality TV experience where the director is a man named Cervantes and the script is your own nervous breakdown. But for Quixote, this is the ultimate toxic verification. He isn't just a man in a cardboard helmet anymore. He is a celebrity. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that Miguel de Cervantes published Part 1 of Don Quixote in 1605, and it became an immediate viral hit, translated into multiple languages and read across the entire Spanish Empire. But by 1614, Cervantes was still living in heavy poverty, watching other people get rich off his creation. You feel that stiff financial tension in the room as you watch Cervantes, who is now an old man with a vibrating tremor in his hand, working on the actual Part 2. He is currently nourishing himself on spite, which is a very effective fuel for a 17th century writer. He is writing a scene where Don Quixote and Sancho Panza encounter characters who have already read Part 1. It's the first Easter egg in literary history, and it sounds like a weighted blanket of irony being dropped over the entire genre of romance. A quirky or fringe tidbit that literary detectives often obsess over is the Avellaneda incident. While Cervantes was taking his time with the real sequel, a mysterious author using the pseudonym Alonso Fernández de Avellaneda published a false Part 2. This book was mean-spirited, toxic, and turned Quixote into a simple, drooling idiot and Sancho into a gluttonous fool. It was a 1614 version of a fanfiction gone horribly wrong. As you trudge through the streets of the village, you see people reading this fake book, their hearter sounding like a stiff and jagged percussion in the morning air. Cervantes was so heavy with rage that he changed the entire plot of his actual Part 2, just to spite the imposter. He had Quixote decide not to go to Justs in Zaragoza, simply because the fake Quixote went there. You probably won't survive the petty brilliance of a man who sabotages his own plot just to prove his rival wrong. But for Miguel, this was a vibrating war for his own legacy. Historians still argue whether Avellaneda was a real person or a toxic pseudonym for one of Cervantes' rivals, perhaps the legendary playwright Lope de Vega. You feel that heavy professional jealousy in the air. It's a stiff and ink-stained atmosphere. You watch as Don Quixote enters a print shop in Barcelona, the 17th century version of a toxic newsroom. The sound in the room is a rhythmic, mechanical ASMR, the clack-thud of the wooden press and the wet slap of the ink balls hitting the metal type. Quixote sees them printing the false sequel and his vibrating heart breaks in high definition. He doesn't see a book, he sees an enchanted betrayal. You probably wouldn't survive a visit to a troll farm in 1605 where the trolls use massive wooden presses and smell of wood ash. But for the knight, this is the most toxic giant he has ever faced. You trudge closer to the printing press, and you see the way the stiff black ink is staining the hands of the workers. The peaceful bedtime vibe is once again interrupted by the sound of the knight's voice, a rhythmic, heavy, drone-off intellectual property defense. Quixote is currently maintaining his brand by telling the printers that the fake book is a toxic lie and that he is the only true knight of La Mancha. You probably wouldn't survive a social media argument with a man who thinks he's a living manuscript. But for the duo on Therode, this war of the sequels is the only thing that makes their journey home feel like a real quest. Sancho, meanwhile, is just trying to figure out if being in a fake book means he doesn't have to pay for his real lunch. The sun is currently maintaining its intensity over the docks of Barcelona, turning the stiff white pages of the fake book into a heavy sea of blinding glare. You see the knight look at the ocean, the first time he has seen it, and his reflection in the water looks as vibrating and fragmented as his own story. You feel the weight of the moment. It's a stiff kind of realization. Quixote isn't just a man fighting windmills anymore. He is a man fighting for the right to own his own madness. He is the original toxic victim of piracy, a hero whose very existence is being weighted down by the ink of a stranger. You probably wouldn't survive a cancel culture event in the 17th century, where the cancellation involves being knocked off your horse by a man in a moon-shaped helmet. But for the knight, the vibrating insult of the fake book is just the rhythmic heartbeat of a finale. As the sun begins to sink over the Mediterranean, casting a heavy gold and purple glow over the harbour, you follow the knight and the squire away from the print shop. The rhythmic clack-clack of the wooden press continues in the background, a mechanical lullaby for a world that is no longer satisfied with just one version of the truth. You realise that while you might survive the sequels as war, the knight's journey home has ensured that your definition of truth is now as stiff and ink-stained as Cervantes' final manuscript. You settle into the vibrating rhythm of the march, the scent of fresh paper and spite trailing behind you like a toxic ghost, and you realise that on this road, the only thing more permanent than iron is the quixotic refusal to let an impostor have the last word. The heavy silence of history is currently being rewritten, one stiff page at a time, and the real Quixote is still there, riding toward a beach where the vibrating moon is waiting to call him home. You trudge along a shoreline where the ground beneath your feet has finally surrendered its parched, white lime dust for something new, a heavy, damp slurry of grey sand and crushed seashells that smells of toxic, rotting kelp and the sharp, coppery tang of the Mediterranean. The air here has lost its brittle, highland chill, replaced by a stiff, humid breeze that tastes of salt and ancient shipwrecks. You are standing on the beach of Barcelona in the year 1615, and the rhythm of the world is no longer the vibrating groan of a windmill. It is the low-frequency, rhythmic roar of the tide. Sh-hiss, sh-hiss. A sound that feels like a weighted blanket of water being pulled over the ears of the earth. You probably won't survive this transition to the coast, not because you'll drown, but because the sheer, unblinking vastness of the ocean is enough to make your modern landlocked, GPS-dependent brain feel as stiff and small as a barnacle on a pier. You watch Don Quixote now. He's standing at the very edge of the surf, his rusted boots sinking into the wet grit. He is a statue of dented iron against the pale, watery blue of a winter morning. To him, the ocean isn't just a body of water. It's an enchanted abyss, a toxic blue infinity where the enchanters have likely hidden the true form of Dulcinea. You see the light catch the salt crust in his armour, remember the hand of glory and the scars of Lepanto, and you realise that for a man who spent his life inland, the sea is the ultimate vibrating mystery. He looks like a man who has reached the end of the map and is currently waiting for the world to provide a new page. You probably wouldn't survive a vacation where the beach activity involves staring into the void until your eyes turn into stiff marbles. But for Quixote, this silence is the heavy prologue to his final battle. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that Barcelona was the only major city Cervantes described with such high-definition realism in the entire novel. Cervantes himself likely lived here during his soldiering days, and he knew the specific toxic smell of the harbour and the way the morning light reflects off the stone walls of the shipyards. You feel that realism now as a rider appears out of the mist, not a vibrating hallucination, but a solid, terrifying reality. The rider is wearing armour so polished it looks like it was forged from a stiff and frozen moon. He calls himself the Knight of the White Moon. He doesn't want Quixote's donkey or his helmet of Mambrino. He wants to settle a toxic debt of honour. He challenges Quixote to a duel, with a single heavy condition. If Quixote loses, he must admit that the White Moon's lady is more beautiful than Dulcinea, and he must return to his village and live a life of stiff and quiet peace for one full year. A quirky or fringe tidbit that 17th century military buffs often discuss is the Barcelona sand factor. Duels on wet sand were notoriously toxic for 16th century horses because the shifting surface made it impossible to maintain a stiff and stable charge. As you watch the horses prepare, the sound is a rhythmic, wet percussion, the splut-thump of hooves hitting the tide line. You probably won't survive a beach duel where your primary concern is a horse with no traction and a suit of armour that weighs as much as a small piano. But for Quixote, this is the vibrating peak of his career. Hesper's Rocinante forward, a horse that has the beach body of a collection of sun-bleached driftwood, and the peaceful bedtime vibe is officially executed by the sound of the Night of the White Moon's superior speed. Historians still argue whether the Night of the White Moon was the villain of the story for destroying Quixote's dream, or the hero for trying to save Alonso's life. As you stand there, the sun is a vibrating white coin in Thesky, reflecting off the white moon's shield and blinding you with a toxic glare. You watch the impact. It is short, brutal, and entirely heavy with physics. The white moon's lance doesn't splinter. It holds stiff as it catches Quixote square in the chest, lifting the lean, gaunt man clean out of his saddle. There is no conspiracy of enchanters this time. No Freston to blame. Just the dull, wet thwap of a man hitting the grey sand and the sound of his brass basin helmet rolling into the surf with a rhythmic, metallic ping-ting gurgle. You probably wouldn't survive being dehorsed by a 17th century athlete, but Quixote is held together by the heavy weight of his own failure. You trudge over to the fallen knight. He looks like a vibrating pile of scrap metal that the ocean has just spit out. The Knight of the White Moon removes his helmet, and you see the face of Sanson Carrasco, the toxic university student from the village who has been following you for 300 miles in disguise. He didn't do this to be mean. He did it to force his friend back to the stiff safety of home before the road killed him. You probably wouldn't survive a friend who tries to help you by nearly breaking your neck with a pole, but in the heavy logic of 1615, this was considered a wellness intervention. Quixote doesn't look up, he whispers, his voice of a vibrating rasp that sounds like sand in a gear. Dulcinea is the most beautiful, even if I am the most unfortunate. He accepts the defeat. He accepts the stiff sentence of peace. The peaceful bedtime vibe returns as the Night of the White Moon rides away, leaving you, Sancho and Quixote alone with the roar of the sea. The toxic energy of the quest has evaporated, leaving behind a heavy and salty melancholy. You feel the weight of the moment. It's a stiff kind of silence. Quixote isn't just defeated in a duel. He is defeated by the vibrating realization that he can't outrun the sun anymore. He is a man who has lost his enchanted armor and is left with only the stiff and cold reality of his own aging body. You probably wouldn't survive a reality check this intense without a therapy session and a tub of ice cream. But for the night, the vibrating cold of the wet sand is just the rhythmic beginning of the end. As the moon rises over the Barcelona harbour, a cold, heavy silver basin that looks exactly like the helmet of Mambrino before it was dented on Therox. You follow the knight and the squire as they begin the stiff and quiet walk away from the ocean. The rhythmic slap hiss of the waves continues in the background, a mechanical lullaby for a hero who has finally been disenchanted by a student with a polished shield. You realise that while you might survive the duel, the white moon has ensured that your definition of glory is now as heavy and grey as the sand in Quixote's hair. You settle into the vibrating rhythm of the retreat, the scent of sea salt and disappointment trailing behind you like a toxic ghost. And you realise that on this beach, the only thing more stiff than the knight's defeat is the quixotic dignity of a man who keeps his word even when it breaks his heart. The heavy silence of history is currently being washed clean by the tide, one stiff step at a time, and them mountains of La Mancha are waiting in the distance, calling the good man back to the library, where the ink is finally starting to run dry. You trudge away from the rhythmic, salt-crusted roar of the Barcelona surf, but the road ahead is no longer a toxic highway of glory. It has turned into a heavy, silent corridor of grey stone and sun-bleached weeds that smells of parched thistle, cold wood ash, and the stiff musk of a horse that has officially given up on the concept of ambition. We are stepping into the melancholic retreat, the long walk home in late 1615, and the air is no longer vibrating with the fire of a quest. It is vibrating with the low frequency, weighted hum of a dream that is slowly being dismantled by the gears of reality. You probably won't survive this transition to the quiet side of history, not because of a bandit, but because the sheer, unadulterated sadness of a hero going home to retire is enough to make your modern, grin-set-oriented brain want to crawl into a weighted blanket of total denial. You find yourself walking at the pace of a funeral procession, which is the only speed Rocinante is currently capable of maintaining without parts falling off. The horse's hooves hit the hard-packed earth, with a stiff, hollow percussion, thud, thud. It's a rhythmic ASMR of exhaustion that vibrates through your shins and reminds you that every mile you walk toward the village is a mile away from the enchanted world of giants. Don Quixote is sitting in his saddle, but he isn't maintaining his posture anymore. He is slumped, his chin resting against his toxic and dented breastplate, his eyes fixed on the donkey's tail in front of him. He is no longer looking for a castle. He is just looking for a place to sit down that doesn't involve iron hinges. You probably wouldn't survive a road trip where the only entertainment is the sound of your own bones creaking, but for the night, this stiff silence is the only thing he has left to give to the world. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that the postal roads of 17th century Spain were the heavy arteries of the empire, but for a defeated man, they were just a long way to go to admit you were wrong. You pass a royal messenger, a carreo, who is riding a fresh horse and carrying leather bags full of toxic bureaucratic decrees. The messenger doesn't even look at the man in the brass bassoon. To the world, Quixote has gone from being a vibrating threat to being just another part of the background radiation of rural poverty. You feel the weight of that invisibility. It's a stiff kind of coldness that makes your rough collar feel like a circle of frozen hemp, a quirky or fringe tidbit that 17th century travel writers often discussed weighs the vibrating nature of mule sickness. Because the gait of a mule or a skeletal workhorse is so uneven, long-distance travellers often developed a stiff condition known as the traveller's colic, which was basically your internal organs being shaken like a toxic martini for 10 hours a day. Some doctors suggested that the only cure was to drink wine treated with pulverized lead. Remember our toxic medical trends. To settle the humours. You probably won't survive the irony of curing a stomachache with a heavy metal poisoning. But for Sancho Panza, the vibrating discomfort of the road is currently being fought with the only medicine he trusts. More proverbs and more cheese. You trudge alongside Sancho, and you realize that he is currently nourishing himself on a new delusion. He sees how sad his master is, so he suggests a plan B. He wants them both to become shepherds. The shepherd Quixotes and the shepherd Panzino. It's a 17th century version of let's just leave the city and start a goat milk soap business on Etsy. You hear him describing the vibrating life of a pastor, playing flutes, sleeping under cork trees, and doming their sheep after their favourite local barmaids. The sound of Sancho's voice, a rhythmic, heavy drone of pastoral fantasy, is the only thing keeping the toxic silence of the retreat from turning into a total mental collapse. You probably wouldn't survive a career change that involves talking to sheep for 14 hours a day. But for the duo, the vibrating promise of a shepherd's life is the last weighted blanket of hope they have left. Historians still argue whether Cervantes intended this shepherd phase as a genuine tribute to the pastoral literature of his time, or as the final toxic insult to Quixote's dignity. As you cross the border back into La Mancha, the air turns stiff and dry again, smelling of parched wheat and the smoke of fires that have already burned out. You see the knight look at a flock of sheep, and for a second you see a vibrating spark in his eye. Is he going to charge? No. He just sighs a heavy sigh and mutters something about the price of wool. The enchantment hasn't been broken, it's been drained. He doesn't see an army anymore. He just sees a toxic pile of potential sweaters. You probably won't survive the heartbreak of seeing a man realize that a sheep is just a sheep. But for Quixote, this is the most stiff and painful duel of all. The duel with the obvious. You move closer to the night as the village of La Mancha finally appears on the horizon, its whitewashed houses looking like vibrating ghosts in the heath haze. The peaceful bedtime vibe is once again grounded by the sound of their village church bell, a slow rhythmic tolling, dong, dong. It's a heavy percussion that marks the end of the third sally. Quixote doesn't enter the village like a hero. He enters like a man who is stiff, with the realization that his library is still walled up, and his niece is still going to lecture him about his toxic hobby. He looks at his lopsided brass helmet, the basin of Mambrino, and he doesn't see a crown. He sees a piece of equipment that needs to be returned to a barber who probably already bought a new one. As the sun begins to sink over the plateau, casting long, heavy shadows of theolive trees across the road, You follow the knight and the squire into the village gates. The rhythmic clack-puff of the hooves is now a stiff and melancholic countdown. You realise that while you might survive the trudge, the melancholic retreat has ensured that your definition of reality is now a weighted blanket of grey sky and dry dirt. You settle into the vibrating rhythm of the arrival, the scent of parched wheat and resigned silence, trailing behind you like a toxic ghost. And you realise that on this road, the only thing more stiff than the knight's defeated body is the quixotic soul that is finally, mercifully, beginning to look for a bed instead of a battle. The heavy silence of history is currently being prepared for a final chapter, and the good man is finally home, while the windmills on the ridge keep turning, wearing in the dark like a vibrating clock that never quite reaches midnight. You trudge away from the village square, but the road doesn't take you to a castle or a battlefield this time. It leads you across a threshold of creaking timber and into a room that has been marinating in a toxic slurry of high-definition silence and the vanilla sweet, suffocating scent of 4,000 decomposing pages. We are stepping into the final candlelit sanctuary of Alonso Quijano, the man formerly known as Don Quixote, and the year is 1616. The air here is no longer vibrating with the manic heat of a quest. It has turned stiff, cool, and smells of medicinal lavender, burnt tallow, and the sharp, coppery tang of a life that is currently being folded up like a map of a country that no longer exists. You probably won't survive this level of quiet, not because of a ghost, but because the sheer, heavy weight of a hera becoming normal, again, is enough to make your modern, novelty-addict brain want to scream into a weighted blanket of total disbelief. You find yourself standing on a floor made of cold, uneven clay tiles, the kind that feels toxic to your bare feet because it seems to be sucking the warmth directly out of your marrow. The room is dim, lit only by a single, guttering candle that is currently performing a vibrating dance on a bedside table, a flame that looks like a tiny yellow lance trying to hold back the encroaching indigo of the heavy night. You are watching Alonso Quijano lie in bed. He is no longer wearing his rusted iron harness. He is wearing a simple linen nightshirt that is stiff with starch and smells of old cupboards. His gaunt face, remember the sorrowful countenance, is pale against the white pillows, looking like a piece of heavy marble that has been weathered by a lifetime of dust and irony. You probably wouldn't survive a wellness check, where the patient is 100% lucid and 100% finished with the concept of hope, but Alonso is currently maintaining his sanity, and it's the most tragic thing you've seen 300 miles. The sound in the room is a rhythmic, clinical ASMR, the slow, vibrating tick of a wooden clock on the mantel and the raspy, heavy breathing of a man who has finally realized that a windmill is just a way to make flour. Hiss phew, hiss phew. It's a slow-motion lullaby that vibrates through the floorboards and reminds you that every breath Alonso takes is a stiff rejection of the enchanters. He has just woken up from a long, toxic sleep, and he has renounced everything. He doesn't call himself Quixote anymore. He calls himself Alonso Quijano the Good. You probably wouldn't survive the series finale of your favorite show if the main character spent the last episode apologizing for having a personality. But for the people in this room, his niece, the priest, and the barber, this lucidity is the vibrating miracle they've been praying for. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that Miguel de Cervantes and William Shakespeare both died in April 1616, within days of each other, though because of the toxic difference between the Gregorian and Julian calendars, they didn't actually die on the same day. It's a heavy cosmic coincidence that the two men who invented the modern soul both decided to check out of the hotel at the exact same time. You feel that stiff sense of an era ending as you watch Anaturi enter the room. The notary is a man who smells of toxic ink and official disappointment. He takes out a long roll of parchment and a quill. The sound in the room shifts to a rhythmic, legal percussion. The scritch-scratch of a pen recording a last will and testament. You probably wouldn't survive the legal paperwork of the 17th century without a lawyer and a stiff drink. But for Alonso, this vibrating document is the only way to ensure that his legacy isn't enchanted by another imposter like Avellaneda. A quirky or fringe tidbit that Cervantes biographers often dwell on is the toxic nature of the author's own final illness. Cervantes was likely suffering from type 2 diabetes, which in 1616 was called the dropsy, a condition that made him vibratingly thirsty and caused his hands to turn stiff and cold. As you watch Quijano reach for a cup of water, his hand trembling like a heavy autumn leaf, you are actually seeing the vibrating reflection of Cervantes himself. The author was dying as he wrote these final pages, pouring his own stiff and physical pain into the knight's final surrender. You probably won't survive the realization that the man who invented funny was currently dying in a toxic apartment in Madrid. But for Miguel, the only way to beat death was to make sure his knight died first, and died legally. Historians still argue whether Don Quixote's return to sanity was a heavy tragedy or a vibrating spiritual victory. Did Cervantes want us to be happy that the madman was cured? Or were we supposed to feel that the world became toxic and grey the moment he stopped seeing giants? You feel that heavy debate in the air as Sancho Panza enters the room. Sancho is stiff with grief, his round face looking like a vibrating plum that's been squeezed too hard. He isn't happy that his master is sane. He falls to his knees by the bed and begs him, in a voice that sounds like a heavy and wet sob, to be crazy just on a more time. He wants to go back to the road. He wants to look for the insula. He wants to believe that a peasant girl can be a princess if you just look at her through the right toxic filter. You probably wouldn't survive a friendship breakup. This intense, but Sancho's vibrating plea is the sound of every reader who ever fell in love with a dream. The candle is maintaining its struggle against the dark, the wax melting in a heavy and lopsided pool that looks like a toxic white mountain range. You see the knight look at Sancho and give him a stiff and gentle smile, a smile that has no vibrating madness left in it. He tells Sancho that the birds off last year aren't in the nests of today. It's the ultimate heavy proverb, a stiff reminder that you can't go back to the enchanted forest once the sun has come up. You feel the weight of the moment. It's a stiff kind of closure. Alonso Quijano is nourishing himself on peace, and the peace is more toxic to his legend than any giant's club. As the priest prepares to give the final rites, the scent of toxic incense, frankincense and myrrh fills the room, mixing with the smell of the vanilla sweet paper. The sound of the priest's voice, a rhythmic, heavy Latin drone, is the last vibrating lullaby for the good man. Quijano closes his eyes, his breathing slowing to a stiff and jagged whisper. Pause hiss. You realize that while you might survive the silence, the Alonso's final breath has ensured that your definition of a hero is now as heavy and complicated as a 17th century will. You settle into the vibrating rhythm of the room, the scent of lavender and death trailing around you like a toxic ghost, and you realize that on this bed, the only thing more stiff than the knight's body is the quixotic truth that the world is only as magical as you are brave enough to believe it is. The notary blows on the ink, and the heavy silence of history is currently being sealed with a stiff red wax. You follow the priest and the barber out of the room, a witness to the moment a good man died, so that a knight could live forever in the vibrating memory of every dreamer who ever looked at a windmill and saw a giant. The candle flickers out, leaving the library in a toxic and total darkness, and you realize that while the sally is over, the vibrating echo of the lance hitting the sail is a sound that will keep the world awake, even while you, finally, mercifully, drift into a heavy and stiff sleep. You trudge out of the heavy, lavender-scented room where the good man has just surrendered his final breath. But the hallway you step into doesn't lead back to the village square. It stretches out into a toxic and infinite corridor of time, where the floor is made of polished marble and the walls are lined with a high-definition mosaic of 5 centuries of ink. We are stepping into the pauper's eternity, the long, vibrating afterglow of a man who died in debt but left behind a kingdom of paper. It is now the modern era, but the air here still smells of that stiff, vanilla-sweet decomposition of 1616 parchment and the sharp, metallic tang of the bronze statues that now guard the crossroads of La Mancha. You probably won't survive this transition into the immortality phase, not because of a curse, but because the sheer, heavy irony of a man who couldn't pay his rent. Becoming the patron saint of the human soul is enough to make your modern ROI-focused brain want to vibrate right out of its skull. You find yourself standing in a vast, heavy library where the silence is so absolute it feels like a weighted blanket made of unread thoughts. The only sound is the rhythmic, mechanical ASMR of a distant ventilation system and the soft, vibrating flutter of a page being turned by a researcher in a white glove. It's a 21st century lullaby that reminds you that while Alonso Quijano is stiff and cold in a grave we'll talk about in a moment, his vibrating madness has been digitized, translated, and bound in every language from Mandarin to Klingon. You are watching the heavy legacy Ofa man who was once rejected by the Spanish crown when he begged for a job in the New World, a quirky or fringe tidbit that often makes historians let out a heavy sigh of, what if? Is the fact that in 1590, Cervantes applied for one of 4 vacant positions in the Americas, including a post as an accountant in the New Kingdom of Granada, modern-day Colombia. The crown's response was stiff and brief, seek here for favours. Basically, they told the hero of Lepanto to recalculate his career goals and stay in Spain. You probably wouldn't survive a job rejection that literally changed the course of Western civilization. But for Miguel, that toxic little note from the government meant he had to stay home, stay broke, and eventually stay in a prison cell long enough to invent the modern novel. Imagine if he had gotten that accounting job. We wouldn't have Don Quixote, but we'd have some exceptionally well-organized 16th century tax spreadsheets. You probably won't survive the realization that the world's greatest book was the result of a failed LinkedIn application. But history loves a vibrating accident. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that Miguel de Cervantes was buried in 1616 in the convent of the Barefoot Trinitarians in Madrid, as a final heavy thank you to the monks who had ransomed him from Algiers. But here is where the toxic luck of his life followed him into death. For nearly 400 years his remains were lost. During a renovation of the convent, his bones and those of his wife were moved, misplaced, and essentially turned into a vibrating mystery. It wasn't until 2015 that forensic scientists, using ground-penetrating radar and a heavy amount of patience, found a stiff wooden crate marked with the initials MC in the crypt. You probably wouldn't survive the 17th century version of misplacing a file. But for Cervantes, being lost in the archives was the most on-brand thing that could have happened. Even his skeleton wanted to stay in a weighted silence until the world was ready to find him again. Historians still argue whether Cervantes intended Don Quixote to be a toxic mockery of a lunatic or a vibrating tribute to the human capacity for hope. In the 17th century, people read it as a stiff comedy. They laughed at the beatings and the broken teeth. It was the 1605 version of a failed compilation video. But by the 19th century, the Romantics decided it was a heavy tragedy about a noble soul crushed by a cynical world. You feel that heavy debate in the air as you trudge past a row of statues in Madrid's Plaza de España. You see the knight and the squire in bronze. Quixote is stiff and tall on his nag, while Sancho is round and vibrating on his donkey. They look like weighted anchors for the Spanish identity. You probably wouldn't survive a vibe check from a bronze statue. But these figures remind you that quixotic is now a word that exists in every dictionary. A stiff reminder that sometimes the most toxic thing you can do is admit that the world is right. You trudge deeper into the heart of the library, and you see the vibrating influence of the night on everything from Flaubert to Dostoevsky to your favorite modern sitcom. Quixote didn't just fight windmills, he invented the buddy comedy. He invented the meta-sequel. He invented the toxic, unreliable narrator. The sound of 1,000 quills scratching across the centuries. Scritch, scratch is the rhythmic heartbeat of a legacy that refuses to die. You probably wouldn't survive the heavy pressure of being the father of all modern fiction, but for the pauper who died in a stiff nightshirt in Madrid, this eternity is the only insula he ever truly needed. He realized that while a real island has toxic taxes and heavy revolts, an island made of ink is a place where you can be a governor forever. The sun is maintaining its struggle against the heavy curtains of the library, casting long, vibrating shadows of the bookshelves across the floor, shadows that look like the stiff lances of a ghost army. You see a copy of the 1605 edition resting under a glass case, its pages stiff with time, but its words still vibrating with life. You feel the weight of the moment. It's a stiff kind of gratitude. Miguel de Cervantes didn't have a hand of glory or a helmet of Mambrino in the end. He just had a toxic amount of Berlitin. He turned his heavy scars into a vibrating map of the human condition. You probably wouldn't survive a life that was 90% disaster and 10% literary fame. But for the man from La Mancha, that 10% was a weighted victory that outlasted the Spanish Empire itself. As the vibrating hum of the library's lights begins to dim, leaving the room in a stiff and moonlit silence that smells of cedar and old paper, you realize that, while the Sally is over, the quixotic dream is the only thing that never actually died. The heavy silence of history is currently being rewritten every time a reader picks up a book and decides to see a giant instead of a windmill. You follow the ghost of the knight and the squire out of the library, a witness to the pauper's eternity, where the only thing more stiff than thereon of the past is the vibrating hope of the future. The ink has finally dried, but the toxic fire in the knight's brain is still burning, whirring in the dark like a vibrating clock that finally reaches the heart of the world. Now, as we trudge back from the parched plains and the blood-soaked decks, the air around you begins to soften. The sharp, acrid scent of gunpowder and the toxic tang of the Spanish road are fading, replaced by the cool, heavy embrace of your own room. The rhythmic clack-clink of hooves and the vibrating roar of the Lepanto cannons have dissolved into a slow, melodic breathing, a weighted blanket of total safety that is currently being tucked around your shoulders. You are no longer a prisoner in Algiers or a knight in a cardboard helmet. You are just a traveller who has reached the end of a very long, very heavy map. The horizon of La Mancha is closing its eyes now, the windmills slowing their vibrating dance until they are just stiff silhouettes against a velvet, indigo sky. The heavy weight of history is lifting, leaving behind only a vibrating peace that feels as stiff and reliable as an old oak door. You can hear the distant, weighted whisper of the wind over the plateau, a sound that is no longer a toxic howling but a gentle, vibrating lullaby. Your thoughts are turning from ink and iron to the soft and quiet world of dreams, where everyone has their own insula, and the giants are always willing to share astery. Let the heavy silence of the library settle over you, a weighted comfort that tells you the quest is complete. The stiff pages of the world are finally being closed, and the vibrating energy of the quest is turning into a slow, steady pulse of rest. You are safe, you are home. The good man has found his peace, and so have you. The stars are blinking down like vibrating rivets in the sky, guarding your sleep with a stiff and eternal loyalty. Sleep now, brave traveller, while the windmills of La Mancha keep watch in the dark, and the dream of the night becomes the vibrating rhythm of your own heart. End of script. Sweet dreams.